Chapter 752. In the boundless Gobi Desert, the whistling wind mixed with sand and dust made it hard for people to open their eyes. The group of 7 from Noah's continent was walking aimlessly in the desert. Since they couldn't fly, Ron and the others had a hard time walking. The ground was scorching hot from the sun, and their leather boots made a thud-thud sound as they walked on the road. Beaumont's behemoth Hao Qin was walking when he suddenly stopped. He bent down and took off his boots. Looking at them, he shook his head helplessly and threw the boots on the ground. What a pity, another pair of shoes is gone. Ron turned his head and saw Hao Qin's 2 big feet that were like iron plates. It turned out that the high temperature had already burned through the soles of his shoes. Hao Qin immediately took out another pair of boots from his space bag and put them on. Mercenaries who went out had to prepare at least 10 or 20 pairs of shoes. Otherwise, if the shoes broke, they wouldn't be able to buy them even if they had the money. For these high and mighty powerhouses from Noah's continent, because they couldn't fly, this trip to the banished lands made them suffer a lot. At this time, the elven high priestess Undine suddenly stopped. She listened carefully and frowned. "Did you hear something? It seems to be coming from that direction." She pointed to the east as she spoke. "It seems to be someone calling for help." Ron also felt it. He took a deep breath and said, "Come, let's go take a look." As the team leader, Ron spoke. No one objected and could only follow Ron. However, what happened next shocked them. In the middle of the high sand dune, there was a huge monster that they had never seen before. It was as big as a house and had 8 huge legs. Its back was covered with a hard shell. The most terrifying thing was that in the middle of the hard shell, there were 8 long tentacles. It looked terrifying and strange. On one of the tentacles, there was a figure hanging upside down. The cry for help came from his mouth. "It's an exotic beast. Prepare for battle." Ron's heart tightened, and he immediately took out the bone staff. The atmosphere suddenly became tense. Noah's God's domain party, who had a tacit understanding with each other, got ready for battle. The demonic beasts also began to transform. "Kill!" Ron's eyes narrowed as killing intent flashed in his eyes. He then waved his bone staff, and a powerful wave of undead energy surged out. Several frost dragons then flew out from the center of the spinning hexagram magic array. In order to rescue the adventurers who were in trouble, everyone unleashed their strongest combat power. Countless powers of various elements blasted towards the unknown monster. Boom! Boom, boom. A large amount of smoke and dust rose from the desert. The exotic beasts that were struck by the power let out miserable cries. What surprised Ron and the others was that this huge monster's strength wasn't as terrifying as its appearance suggested. After a short while, it couldn't hold on any longer. With a wail, its 8 long legs pulled at the quicksand, and its huge body began to dive. "Don't let him escape." Babu let out a strange cry and pounced forward. "Pay attention to saving people," Undine reminded. As soon as her voice fell, Ron took the lead and jumped out. He appeared on the tentacle of the huge monster, holding a sharp bone spear in his hand and ruthlessly stabbing at the tentacle. The monster was in pain and immediately let go of its tentacle. Ron grabbed the person and brought him back. At this time, the huge monster had completely dived into the sand and disappeared without a trace. It's a pity that it still escaped. Frigga was a little regretful. She didn't expect that although the monster was very weak, its defense was very strong. Yes, its shell is too hard. Babu also returned to his human form and said unwillingly, "I'm afraid it's even harder than my tortoise shell." "Forget it. It's fine as long as we save them." Undine didn't mind. Her goal was to save people, not kill exotic beasts. Ron only felt that the person in his hand was abnormally light. It didn't feel like a person's weight at all. After putting him down, he felt that he was very familiar. Ron thought for a long time and finally remembered. Wasn't this the gnome he met in the Shualon continent? You're a gnome? That person was wearing green, tattered clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed for a long time. He was short about 4 meters tall. His ears were like elves, standing up sharply. From his appearance, there was no doubt that he was a gnome. Gnomes were a big race that existed in all the dimensions, but not in the Noah continent. The appearance of the gnome attracted everyone's interest. They all gathered around and curiously sized up this race that they had never seen before. That gnome struggled to get up. Although his body was covered in dust, he wasn't injured. Although his clothes were tattered, they were neatly tidied. As he had received help from the gnomes in the Shualon continent, Ron had an indescribable good impression of them. He sized them up and asked hesitantly, "May I know who you are?" Before Ron could finish his words, that gnome stood at attention and gave a standard military salute. "Hello, everyone. My name is Pamir. I'm from the Gnome Empire in the main plane. I'm a colonel in the 75th Army of the Emperor. Thank you for your help." "Colonel?" Ron was stunned for a moment, then smiled. "You're welcome. When it's within my ability, I'll give appropriate help to adventurers in the wild. It's in line with the spirit of a mercenary. Sacred domain." The dark colossal dragon R.A. Firth frowned slightly. The gnome in front of them wasn't very strong, only about the mid-level of the sacred domain. With such strength, appearing in the wild of the banished land was undoubtedly an act of suicide. Although the unknown monster just now was weak, it still had the strength of a low-level divine realm. It could be said that it was a miracle that this gnome, with the strength of the sacred domain, could survive until now. The young gnome colonel rubbed his head and said, "Thank you. If it weren't for you, I would have been eaten by the Canis beast." Only then did everyone know that the huge monster with 8 legs and 8 tentacles was called the Canis beast. What a strange name. Ron was curious about this gnome. "I came with my army, but a few days ago I got separated from my army." So he glanced at everyone and said embarrassedly, "I'm sorry, everyone. Do you have anything to eat? I haven't eaten for a few days." A few magical beasts turned their heads away. This gnome's strength was only in the sacred domain, and they had already lost interest in him. They had always been arrogant, and it was impossible for them to take a powerful being from the sacred domain seriously. "I have some here." Ron didn't think too much about it. He enthusiastically took out milk, bread, and other things from his space bag and stuffed them into Pamir's hands. "There's no need for so much, just a little is enough." Pamir's face flushed red, as if he felt the coldness of the others. He knew that in this world where the strong ruled, the other party had a reason to look down on him. Pamir took a little and wolfed it down on the spot. Ron nodded inwardly. This gnome did indeed have the temperament of a soldier. Although he wasn't very strong, his indifference towards life and death wasn't something that just anyone could do. After Pamir finished eating, he wiped his mouth, thanked everyone, and saluted. Ron asked, "Colonel Pamir, what do you plan to do next?" Pamir thought for a moment. "The most important thing now is to get in touch with my army and return to the main plane as soon as possible. I didn't think that we'd all been deceived. This was all part of the Red Silk Army scheme." Speaking of this, Pamir's face was full of indignation, and his voice carried a trace of anger. "Those damn bastards." Ron was stunned when he heard this. "Conspiracy? What scheme? What? You don't know?" Colonel Pamir was stunned. "It's a scheme for the treasures in the exiled land. We were tricked into coming here like the other adventurers. This is a complete lie. So that's how it is." Ron and the rest suddenly realized that the exiled land, which had always been desolate, had suddenly become so lively. It must have been brought about by the so-called treasures. Greed drove people crazy. They had even lost their minds. This was not false at all. "That's why I have to go back as soon as possible." Pamir spread out his hands. "I've had enough of this godforsaken place." Ron nodded. "It seems like our goal is the same. As long as we find the nearest teleportation point, we can all go back." Ron's words were undoubtedly an invitation to Pamir, and this action caused the others to be slightly unhappy. It must be known that in this dangerous foreign plane, having one more person meant one more degree of danger. Moreover, this gnome only had the strength of the sacred domain. To put it bluntly, this gnome was a burden to the Noah continent's divine realm team. Frigga tugged at Ron's sleeve, intending to remind him of his words and actions, but Ron acted as if he did not see it and gently broke free. Ron smiled. "Colonel Pamir, if you don't mind, we can travel together. If we can't find your army, we can bring you to the teleportation point." Pamir was overjoyed. Thank you so much. Pamir was so excited that his voice trembled. He knew that it was a great honor for a team with the strength of the sacred domain to accept him. Firth, Frigga, Hao-Chin, and the rest looked at each other and frowned, the dissatisfaction on their faces growing. If not for the fact that Ron was their leader, they would have already flared up. He was just a sacred domain expert. Was his strength, identity, and status worthy of being treated like this by these experts of the divine realm? Firth snorted to express his dissatisfaction. He was unhappy with Ron because he was being emotional. All right, then we're teammates now. Ron did not care about the attitude of the other members, smiling as he introduced them to Pamir one by one. However, apart from Undine and Frigga, none of the experts of the divine realm treated this new goblin member well. Those with a good attitude nodded slightly as a greeting, while those with a bad attitude turned their heads away and pretended not to see him. Pamir did not mind. Every time Ron introduced someone, he stood at attention and saluted. After introducing everyone, Ron smiled as he took out a map. I think it won't be too long before we go home. From a map, we should be able to walk to the next teleportation point in about 20 days. Hearing the news that they could go home, everyone was immediately energized. Even Hao-Chin, who was usually reserved, had a smile on his face. Colonel Pamir from the Goblin Empire was not so optimistic. His eyes were fixed on the map in Ron's hands, his expression solemn. After a long while, he sighed. Lord Ron, I don't think you should celebrate too early. If I'm not wrong, the next teleportation point we're going has already been destroyed. Everyone was shocked when they heard this. Chapter 753. Ron was shocked. Pamir, how did you know? I've said it before. This is all part of the Red Silk Army's scheme. Pamir sighed and raised his head to look at Ron. They issued a mission in the mortal plane and used lies to lure us and all the other adventurers here. Their goal naturally isn't that simple. Their true goal is probably the Bartlos Planar Prison. Pamir said coldly. The Bartlos Planar Prison? Everyone was slightly shocked. That's right, it's the Bartlos Planar Prison. Pamir took the map of the exiled land from Ron's hands and pointed at the center of the map. Ron's gaze froze. Bartlos Prison was located in the deepest part of the exiled land. On the map that Lord Noah had given him, it was marked as a danger zone with a red pen. 100,000 years ago, the Red Silk Army ignited the flames of war in the mortal plane. They even defeated the mortal plane's army and established their own force. Unfortunately, their good times didn't last long. They were eventually annihilated by the combined forces of the mortal plane. Their leader, the commander of the Red Silk Army, Utaris, is now imprisoned in Bartlos Prison. Frigga blinked and couldn't help but ask, that's just a matter of the mortal plane. What does it have to do with us? If I were the Red Silk Army and wanted to rescue their leader, the best way to do so would be to think of a way to lure all the adventurers here and then destroy all the teleportation points, cutting off their escape route. This way, if they want to leave this godforsaken land of exile, there's only one way, through Bartlos Prison's planar passage. Pamir laid the map on the ground and pointed at the symbols on the map. He spoke frankly and with assurance, showing the confidence of a soldier. In other words, if we want to leave this place, we have no choice but to enter the Bartlos Planar Prison. Whether we're willing or not, we'll become cannon fodder for the Red Silk Army. At this point, Pamir's expression became agitated. He stretched out his fist and slammed it on the ground, showing the anger in his heart. Ron and the others looked at each other. Pamir's words sounded like a fantasy, but they couldn't help but believe it. Their way home, which was the teleportation point, had already been destroyed. Feeling that he was too agitated, Pamir took a few deep breaths, forced himself to calm down, and said calmly, to be able to come up with such a perfect plan, he is definitely a genius. We have all been used by him. Hearing the gnome's words, the dark WRMRA Firth frowned. Is there no other way? No. Pamir shook his head. The land of exile is a place where sinners are banished and imprisoned in the main plane. Even if you have the planar teleportation scroll, you won't be able to break the space restriction set up by the gods. Planar teleportation scroll? Ron's heart skipped a beat. He recalled the necromancy grand Magus Nicole he met in the snow orchid continent. At that time, she had used a planar transfer scroll to leave this space. Planar transfer scrolls were expensive, and ordinary adventurers wouldn't be able to get their hands on them. Now that they couldn't even use planar transfer scrolls, things were a little tricky. At this moment, the Beaumont behemoth Hao Qin said in a low voice, "So, other than the Bartlow's prison, we have no other way out?" "Yes." The gnome Colonel Pamir nodded heavily. Everyone couldn't make up their minds for a moment, and they all looked at Ron. Ron muttered to himself for a moment, and then slowly raised his head. "Colonel Pamir, I want to know, what kind of place is the Bartlow's Planar Prison?" The Bartlow's Planar Prison. Pamir's heart trembled, and a trace of fear appeared on his face. "Master, we have already destroyed all the teleportation points in the land of exile." Under the night sky, the tall apes knelt down on one knee before a short, thin, black-robed young man as he spoke respectfully. "Very good, not bad." The black-robed young man was sitting on a rock, absent-mindedly looking at a small red flower in his hand. He slowly stood up and turned to look at the iron-armored ape, his face returning to its usual cold expression. The black-robed young man paused. "How many of our brothers are left?" Apes thought for a moment. "Master, we still have about 3,000 brothers that we brought to the land of exile. Apart from the fierce resistance of some powerful adventurers when we destroyed the last planar transfer point, we suffered some losses. Other than that, everything else went smoothly." The black-robed young man nodded indifferently, not giving any comment. "Next, we can carry out the next step of the plan." The black-robed young man slowly raised his head, a glint in his black eyes. "Pass down my orders. Have all our brothers remove the army insignia on their arms, and then mix into the adventurers group and lead them into the Bartlow's Planar Prison." "Yes, master," Apps replied and stood up. "Hee, this way. Those foolish adventurers will have no choice but to enter the Bartlow's Planar Prison and fight against those powerful ancient guardians." Apps rubbed his hands excitedly. "Not only can we use these cannon fodder to deal with the ancient guardians of the Bartlow's prison, we can also let our brothers conserve their strength." "Master, your plan is indeed brilliant. Everything is developing according to your plan. There's no other way. Our army can't take any more trouble. I have to conserve my strength as much as possible to prepare for the next step of the plan." The black-robed young man smiled faintly, a slight look of regret on his face. However, one could tell from his eyes that he was quite satisfied with his plan. Without using a single soldier, he had used only his wits to deal with the ancient guardians of the Bartlow's Planar Prison. Maximizing the benefits at the smallest cost had always been his strong suit. Master is wise. The entire plan was meticulous and closely linked, showing his master's terrifying mind that was close to that of a demon's. App's tone towards the black-robed young man was full of admiration. At this moment, he thought for a moment and could not help but say, "Right, master, those cannon fodder," referring to the adventurers who entered the Bartlow's Planar Prison, "can only deal with the ancient guardians. However, don't forget that there's an extremely powerful and terrifying existence in the Bartlow's Planar Prison, ancient WRM Maxwell." Apps gritted his teeth fiercely. "Master, if we can't defeat this terrifying fellow, we won't be able to save Lord Utaris, the guardian of the Bartlow's Planar Prison, ancient WRM Maxwell. Not to mention Apps himself. Even his master, who was many times stronger than him, was far from being a match for Maxwell. After all, Maxwell, who guarded the Bartlow's Planar Prison, was said to have the power of a god. If they could not defeat ancient WRM Maxwell, it would be useless even if they defeated all the ancient guardians. Ancient WRM Maxwell. Hearing this name, the black-robed young man's eyes shone. After a moment of silence, the corners of his mouth curled up slightly. "Don't worry, Apps. You just have to deal with the ancient guardians of the Bartlow's Planar Prison. As for the guardian, Maxwell." At this point, the black-robed young man's hand clenched tightly. With a pung, a cloud of black smoke rose from his pale, slender hand, and the yellow flowers in his hand were instantly burned to ashes. Chapter 754. As Pamir had expected, when Ron and the others arrived at the temporary teleportation point at the Terminus Plateau, they found that it had been destroyed. There was no one there. They had no choice but to turn east and head in the direction of Bartlow's prison. Just as Pamir had said, even if they knew that this was a trap, they had no choice but to continue forward. They had no other choice. Unlike Ron and the others from the Noah continent, the young Colonel Pamir was obviously an experienced adventurer. Not only was he familiar with all the exotic beasts in the exiled lands, he was also familiar with the situation in the other main plains. Along the way, Ron felt enlightened from his conversations with him. Pamir was a soldier, and he was used to holding himself to the standards of a soldier. Everywhere he went, he would take care of everything, make the beds, pitch the tents, and arrange everything in an orderly manner. No one would be able to find fault with him. Most importantly, Pamir was a good cook. These divine realm experts, who had eaten all sorts of delicacies, were full of praise for his cooking. Even the divine realm experts like Firth and Clyde slowly changed their attitudes towards Pamir. They no longer displayed their arrogance, and instead accepted him as a member of their group. Apart from being a little weak, this fellow is still very useful. Frigga looked at Pamir and nodded. She then glanced at Ron. I wonder where he found such a treasure. Lord Ron, the Grey Haze Forest is just up ahead. Pamir held a map in his hand and pointed to a spot not far ahead as he spoke to Ron. After passing through the Grey Haze Forest, it won't be long before we reach the Bartlow's planar prison. Oh, Ron replied indifferently. He raised his head slightly and saw that the Grey Haze Forest in the distance was shrouded in fog, making it impossible to see clearly. How long will it take to pass through the misty forest? Frigga stood on a rock, tiptoeing as she looked at the fog in front of her. The breeze blew at her long skirt, making her look extremely beautiful. With our current speed, I'm afraid it will take more than 60 days. Goblin Colonel Pamir did a quick calculation and replied. So long? Frigga's mouth opened into an O shape, her face full of surprise. This time is already considered optimistic. Pamir shook his head. The Grey Haze Forest is the largest forest in the exiled land. It's like a loyal guard that guards the Bartolo's planar prison. There are many strange beasts inside, and they're all very powerful. We're lucky that we haven't been exterminated yet. Firth said, if only we could fly, we could get there in a day. After venting their frustrations, they still had to walk a certain path. Everyone could only shake their heads and step into the Grey Haze Forest. As soon as they entered the Grey Haze Forest, everyone felt that they were surrounded by a faint white fog. They couldn't see clearly for tens of meters in front of them. Not only was their vision affected, even their spiritual senses were affected. Puff! Huff! At this moment, a black figure pounced into the thick fog and landed on Ron's arm. It was the crow that Ron had summoned with necromancy magic. It flapped its feathers a few times and cried out, caw, caw. Ron waved his hand, and the crow cried out strangely. With a pung sound, it turned into black smoke and disappeared. Ron shook his head and said to everyone, my necromancy magic has also lost its effect. I can't see clearly in the fog. Don't worry, I have a way. Pamir pondered for a moment, then reached into his pocket and took out something. What's this? Ron asked curiously. Pamir had taken out an exquisite, small, square metal box. It was about the size of a palm and had a white transparent glass cover at the top. There were complicated patterns engraved on the inside. This is a magic compass. It can guide us in the right direction, Pamir said with a smile. After we were separated from the army, I didn't bring anything but this. He opened the glass cover of the box. At this moment, the box in Pamir's hand emitted a faint blue light. Within the glass cover, a long black needle spun quickly. Moments later, it stopped at a certain mark with a whoosh. Got it, Pamir exclaimed in surprise. He pointed in the direction of the needle. That's the direction of Bartlow's prison. Ron and the others were already used to Pamir's miraculous abilities. They naturally believed him without a doubt. Then let's go, Firth urged. He couldn't wait to return. Pamir looked around and said in a low voice, everyone, we've already entered the Grey Haze Forest. Everyone should be careful. Hearing Pamir's words, everyone felt a chill in their hearts and became alert. There are countless powerful creatures in the gray haze forest. If you can avoid fighting, try to avoid it. You should know that there are many ancient guardians waiting for us in the Bartlow's planar prison. Pamir added. There were countless plants in the gray haze forest. These plants looked extremely strange. Even Pamir couldn't name some of them. At this time, in the silent gray haze forest, on a huge branch, a shadow slowly emerged. His eyes fell on the members of the Noah's Divine Realm team. Because they were too far away, no one noticed. The black shadow sized him up for a moment. His gaze was like that of a hunter looking at his prey. Not long after, his gaze fell on the leader, Ron, and he froze. It was actually a necromancer? The black shadow's expression was a little shocked. Then, the corners of his mouth curled up slightly as he laughed. Interesting. I didn't expect to meet a necromancer. If that's the case, I'll let them go. The black shadow smiled faintly and slowly disappeared. Everyone walked in the gray haze forest. After an unknown amount of time, a fragrance slowly wafted from the thick fog. Where's that fragrance coming from? Ron sniffed, a trace of doubt flashing across his face. It smells so good, Frigga sighed, a trace of intoxication on her face. Her feet involuntarily walked in the direction of the fragrance. A few dozen steps in front of her was a blooming, fresh flower the size of a faceplate. Its lace was yellow and layered like 1,000 layers of cake. In the middle was a bright red stamen. This was the source of the enchanting fragrance. Pamir seemed to have thought of something. His expression changed slightly as he shouted, "Stop, Miss Frigga. Don't go." Frigga didn't seem to hear Pamir. Her footsteps did not stop as she slowly approached the fresh flower. At this moment, Undine finally came to her senses. Her expression changed drastically. "Frigga, be careful. That's not a plant." Unfortunately, Undine's warning came a little too late. The delicate flower shook its body and transformed into a ferocious demon. It opened its huge mouth, revealing sharp teeth, and viciously bit at Frigga. In an instant, Frigga's eyes regained their clarity. When she saw the bloody mouth of the flower, her face turned pale with fright. "Frigga, speaker!" Everyone cried out in alarm. Everything happened too quickly. It was so fast that no one could react. They could only watch as the fairy dragon Frigga was swallowed by the terrifying strange flower. At this moment, Frigga felt her body tighten. She was pulled back a few steps, barely dodging the strange flower's attack. The one who made the move was Ron. His reaction was the fastest, and he was also the closest to Frigga. At the critical moment, he saved her life. Seeing that it was Ron who saved her, Frigga blushed and thanked him in a low voice. When the strange, giant flower missed its target, it began to wriggle crazily. It seemed to have emotions as it let out angry roars. The strange, giant flower had already lost its previous tender and beautiful color, becoming ugly and ferocious. Its huge mouth was constantly dripping disgusting saliva. What is this thing? Ron looked at the strange, giant flower in front of him in shock. Undine said in a low voice, "This thing is definitely not a plant. I can't sense any natural aura from it. On the contrary, it seems a little like a beast. That's right. It's a beast, the psychedelic piranha flower." At this moment, Pamir interjected. He looked at the strange, giant flower in front of him with a serious expression. "The psychedelic piranha flower looks like a plant, but it's actually a beast. Its hunting method is very strange. It first uses a strange fragrance to confuse its prey, then suddenly attacks. It's one of the most difficult beasts to deal with in the gray haze forest. Then let's go quickly. I really don't want to go up against this disgusting thing." Frigga looked at the psychedelic piranha flower in front of her and felt her stomach churn. This thing's appearance was really too disgusting. It was as if an animal's mouth was placed on a flower. "I'm afraid it's too late." Pamir sighed. "We've seen the psychedelic piranha flower. This means that we've entered its territory." Just as Pamir finished speaking, the surroundings suddenly changed. There were zzz sounds coming from the forest, as if a large number of things were rapidly approaching. Be careful. Following Di Luo's shout, countless psychedelic piranha flowers poked their heads out of the forest. Their yellow petals turned into sharp scales, and the stamen in the middle extended sharp teeth. There's also a long, disgusting tongue dripping with saliva. At this moment, the countless psychedelic piranha flowers opened their mouths. Immediately after, traces of fishy red liquid sprayed out from their mouths. Zzz, the highly corrosive liquid sprayed onto the ground, and a large hole appeared in the ground. Green smoke rose from the hole, and the stench assailed their nostrils. There's also a trace of a hallucinatory aura that made them feel dizzy and sleepy. What a terrifying, corrosive power. Even someone as strong as Ron couldn't help but be shocked when he saw this. The corrosive liquid that the psychedelic piranha flowers spat out was really too terrifying. Even his white bone shield had a large hole corroded through it. Countless psychedelic piranha flowers had already surrounded them. 3 layers on the inside and 3 layers on the outside, surrounding them like an iron bucket. Countless psychedelic piranha flowers stretched out of the forest, their mouths wide open, revealing their eerie white teeth. It was a horrifying sight. Countless tendrils extended from the ground and suddenly wrapped around Ron and the rest. Kill! Charge out! At this point, even an idiot could smell the danger in the air. In an instant, everyone was ready for battle, and the magic beasts began to transform. R.A. Firth transformed into a huge dark dragon. Hao Qin transformed into a Beaumont, and Frigga transformed into her fairy dragon form. Nature Priestess Undine and Divine Necromancer Ron also shook their staffs and chanted. R.A. Firth roared angrily and spat out a large amount of dark dragon breath. Beaumont Hao Qin's fist glowed with a trace of golden light and fiercely punched at the psychedelic piranha flowers. Countless skeletons were summoned, and the vines that extended from the ground frantically wrapped around the flowers. Ron glanced at Pamir, only to see him take out a small golden pistol from somewhere and join the ranks of the magic beasts. Boom! Boom! Chapter 755. The fierce battle startled countless birds, and a powerful aura was released in an instant, spreading outwards like a semicircle. The densely packed psychedelic man-eating flowers, like an army that had heard a command, gathered into a group, opened their mouths full of sharp teeth, and spat out a strong corrosive acid at the same time. For a moment, an intense sour smell filled the air. Boom! Boom! Swish! Swish! One by one, the psychedelic man-eating flowers were burned, but even more psychedelic man-eating flowers gathered. Not only did their numbers not decrease, but there were even more of them. Damn it, why are there so many strange flowers? Frigga's face carried a trace of anger. They seem to be endless no matter how we kill them. As she spoke, she flapped the small wings on her back, and a powerful force quickly gathered. Lightning descended and blasted a large group of psychedelic man-eating flowers into ashes. I feel the same. Although these strange flowers aren't very powerful, this acid is too annoying, Hao Qin said with some annoyance. In his Beaumont form, he couldn't dodge at all in this narrow space. His skin was corroded by the acid, and bursts of green smoke appeared, causing him to cry out in pain. Even the thick skin of the dark dragon R.A. Firth couldn't withstand it. This acid was too terrifying. Not only that, but Noah's team also discovered to their horror that although the psychedelic man-eating flowers they destroyed looked withered like they were dead, after a while, they once again glowed with vitality. As more and more psychedelic man-eating flowers joined the battle, Ron's team gradually showed signs of defeat. Roar! The dark dragon R.A. Firth let out an earth-shaking roar, and his huge body began to shrink. Then, with a flash, he appeared not far in front of Ron, and said anxiously, "Ron, let's break through quickly. There are too many of these strange flowers." Ron's heart trembled. He just realized that countless psychedelic man-eating flowers had already surrounded them in 3 layers, and the surrounding area was already filled with densely packed psychedelic man-eating flowers. Some even rose into the air and sprayed acid at them from above. "All right, let's break through." Ron gritted his teeth and said coldly. "It's useless." Suddenly, a voice came from the side. Ron turned around and saw Goblin Colonel Pamir. He held a small golden pistol in his hand, raised it, and took aim. Bang! It hit the stamen of a psychedelic piranha flower, and the flower fell to the ground. Pamir quickly took out a golden pellet and put into the pistol. He pulled the bolt, looked at Ron and Firth, and said in a low voice, "Since we found the first psychedelic man-eating flower, we have stepped into its trap. This area is within its sphere of influence. No matter how far we go, it will catch up with us." "It? You mean?" "That's right. What we're facing is only a single psychedelic man-eating flower. What we're seeing now are only its branches." Ron took a deep breath, looked at the dense, strange flowers in front of him, and frowned. "Then what should we do now?" "Find its main body," Pamir said resolutely. "Its main body is very weak. As long as we find it, we can destroy it. However, if we continue to be entangled with its branches, what awaits us is death." "Then where's its main body?" At this time, fairy dragon Fu Lija had appeared behind Ron and the others at some point and asked softly. Pamir looked at Undine, who was not far away. "That depends on Lady Undine. Doesn't she train in the power of nature? I believe she can find the main body of the psychedelic man-eating flower." Ron immediately communicated with Undine through his spiritual sense. Soon, the white-haired Undine appeared in front of them and hesitated before speaking. "I can try, but I can't guarantee success. O great goddess of nature, with your supreme power, please give your followers the correct guidance." Undine chanted an incantation and raised her jade-green staff up high, emitting a bright light. Her robe and long white hair danced in the wind. The guidance of the goddess of nature did not have any offensive power. It was a type of support magic. Its purpose was to guide people through the fog and see the truth, similar to the eye of truth. Undine opened her eyes. At this moment, her eyes had turned green. At this moment, she saw a faint green shadow amidst the seemingly chaotic and disorderly phantasmagoric man-eating flowers. "It's there." Undine pointed in front of her. "I see it." Ron looked in the direction Undine was pointing. Other than a large rock, he saw nothing. "It's underground." Firth was the first to react. "Roar." But Hao Qin was already on the move. With a loud shout, he stretched out his huge fist that was as big as a casserole. His fist glowed with a golden light. Boom! Hao Qin, who had transformed into a behemoth, heavily punched the ground. Roar! It did not sound like a beast. On the contrary, it sounded more like a plant's cry. The sound came from underground. Following that, the ground started to shake. Boom! 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 It sounded like something was moving underground. Not long after, a strange protrusion appeared on the ground. Following that, the ground cracked open, spewing out large amounts of jade-green light. This is Ron, and the rest were dumbfounded. What appeared before them was a huge monster that was dozens of meters tall, like a skyscraper. Its body was covered in jade-green leaves, and its exposed skin was wrapped in tree trunks. Under the flower stem, there were sharp spikes. The most terrifying thing was its head. It was like a huge flower. Its disc-like face was filled with disgusting mouths. Corrosive, acidic saliva flowed out of its mouths. When it dripped onto the ground, green smoke rose. This is its main body. Attack! Following Pamir's command, Ron and the rest immediately followed. Firth transformed back into the dark dragon and breathed out dark dragon breath at the psychedelic man-eating flower. Ron also summoned the frost dragon to assist in the attack while casting necromancy magic. Just as Pamir had said, although the branches of the psychedelic man-eating flower were powerful, its main body was very weak. After just one round of attack, it could not take it anymore. Out of animal instinct, it wanted to escape. Ron and the rest held their breath and increased their attacks. Countless undead began to surround it. Skeleton warriors, skeleton magicians, black knights, and others were summoned continuously. The psychedelic man-eating flower was not easy to deal with. Its huge body moved, and countless branches began to gather like a sturdy wall in front of everyone. Following that, its main body slowly sank. "Be careful, don't let it escape," Pamir shouted. He had already predicted that the other party would escape. Kill. The morale of Noah's team was high. It was not often that they had the chance to beat a drowning dog. However, there were too many branches of the psychedelic man-eating flower. They were densely packed and stacked on top of each other. The corrosive acid it spat out made everyone abnormally fearful. No matter how hard they tried, they could feel the aura of the psychedelic man-eating flower gradually leaving. Everyone was helpless. They could only watch as the psychedelic man-eating flower's figure disappeared into the distance. "Damn it, we actually let it get away." Ron cursed in his heart. His eyes were filled with unwillingness. They had almost died in the hands of this monster that looked like a plant, but was actually a beast. Bang! Just as everyone was about to give up, a loud sound suddenly came from the southeast of the gray haze forest. Boom! As if it had been hit by something, the huge, psychedelic man-eating flower suddenly tilted and let out a miserable cry. That's what? This sudden turn of events stunned everyone. Pamir stood there in a daze, a look of surprise and joy in his eyes. Bang! 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 The loud sound came again. What was different was that this time, the sound was much more concentrated. Green smoke rose from the southeast. Who was attacking the psychedelic man-eating flower? Noah's team's hearts were in their mouths. Was the person who came an enemy or a friend? It was not a good thing for another group of adventurers to appear in this dangerous gray haze forest. At this moment, Ron noticed Pamir's strange behavior. He walked over and asked with concern, "What's wrong, Pamir?" It's my army." Pamir's face was filled with agitation. At this moment, tears were streaming down his face. It was none other than the elite troops of the Goblin Empire's 75th Army. "Yes, that's right. It's my army that's looking for me." Everyone was shocked when they heard this. In an open space in the northwest of the gray haze forest, a densely packed goblin army suddenly appeared. Countless metal lumps were arranged in a fixed position. They were covered in hard armor, and there were 8 pairs of wheels under them. Long metal pipes extended from the top of the metal lumps. The metal pipes could rotate according to direction, and that was where the loud sound came from. At this moment, Ron saw a goblin standing on a tall rock. He was wearing a military uniform similar to Pamir's, but the emblem on his shoulder was slightly different. His expression was resolute, and his eyes were fixed in front of him. It seemed like he was the commander. "Pass down my orders. Everyone, 361 degrees ahead. Aim." A loud and powerful voice came from the forest. Under the goblin's command, countless metal pipes were erected and aimed at the huge, psychedelic piranha flower. "Fire." At the goblin's command, the countless metal pipes flashed with fire at the same time. Boom, 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 boom. Ron saw countless black objects drawing beautiful parabolic trajectories in the air and violently bombarding the psychedelic piranha flower's head. Gah! The psychedelic piranha flower wailed, and those black objects bloomed on its head. Ron did not expect those black objects to be so powerful. In just one round of bombardment, the psychedelic piranha flower was seriously injured. The place where the psychedelic piranha flower was had turned into a sea of fire. The flames burned fiercely, and the goblin commander's face was red. A cold smile appeared on his face. "Pass down my orders. Black Bat Mobile Squadron, move out. Don't let it escape," the goblin commander said coldly. Hum, hum, hum. Under everyone's shocked gazes, a strange metal lump rose from the forest once again. The propeller on its head spun quickly, bringing up large amounts of smoke and dust. There were hundreds of strange metal lumps rising from the forest. They circled in the air, densely packed together. It was quite a spectacular sight. "What is this? It can actually fly. This is really too strange." The appearance of the flying metal lumps caused Noah and the rest to gasp in surprise. "These are our goblin military helicopters. They belong to the Black Bat Mobile Squadron of the 75th Army. They are driven by crystal energy and are not limited by the ground's gravity. Seeing that Ron and the rest did not understand, Pamir patiently explained. Duh, 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 whoosh, whoosh, boom, boom. At this time, the goblin military helicopters began to show their might. The machine gun bullets below the nose rained down like rain, and the missiles below the wings seemed to have grown eyes as they bombarded the psychedelic piranha flower. In an instant, there were violent explosions around the psychedelic piranha flower. The military helicopters whistled past and dropped countless missiles, turning the surroundings into a sea of fire. So powerful. Everyone sucked in a breath of cold air. Judging from the attacks of the metal lumps, one of their attacks was no weaker than a forbidden spell. It might even be more powerful than a forbidden spell. Firth's expression was ugly. He was thinking that if he really faced these military helicopters, it would be a problem whether he could escape unscathed. Although the metal lumps were not large in size, the flames they spat out and the long trails of white smoke they shot out were not to be underestimated. Their might could not be underestimated. This was the true strength of the main army of the Goblin Empire. A short moment later, the military helicopters that the Goblin commander had spoken of had finished their battle and returned. The gigantic psychedelic piranha flower could not be any more dead. Its corpse had been blasted into pieces, and under the constant burning of the incendiary bombs, it slowly turned into ashes. Everyone heaved a sigh of relief. Just as Ron was having a headache over how to contact those fellows, Colonel Pamir began to shout. Chapter 756. Hearing Pamir's voice, the Goblin commander froze for a moment before turning around. At this time, he could not believe his eyes. Colonel Pamir, why are you here? You're still alive? Heavens, that's great. I thought you were eaten as a snack by the exotic beasts. The two quickly ran over and hugged each other tightly, laughing and shouting excitedly. Everyone come out and see. Our dear Colonel Pamir is back. He's still alive. He's still alive. Ha ha. One by one, the goblins poked their heads out of the iron lumps with iron pipes and flying iron lumps. When they saw Pamir, they were both surprised and happy. The goblins wore semicircular helmets on their heads and wore loose green combat uniforms. The goblins who came down from the military helicopters had a pair of goggles on their helmets and wore blue combat uniforms. It's the commander. Commander! When the goblins saw Pamir, they all saluted. It seemed that Pamir was their superior. Pamir slapped P-Way's shoulder hard. Haha, kid, your command isn't bad. I was worried that after I went missing, you, as the deputy commander, would lead my 75th Legion into a pit. Not bad. This time the tactic of annihilating the psychedelic man-eating flower was well organized. Ha! P-Way scratched his head embarrassedly and laughed. It's all thanks to your guidance, Colonel. The brothers of the 75th Legion are united, so we can come all the way here. Right, Colonel. Why are you here? P-Way asked, looking at Ron and the others with a vigilant gaze. They saved me, Pamir said. He recounted how Ron saved him. As he spoke, Ron looked at the goblins carefully. Each of them was wearing a well-ironed military uniform. Although they were short, they looked very heroic. Their eyes showed the seriousness and coldness of a soldier. They were different from the goblins Ron met in the snow orchid continent. These goblins were more noble and civilized. Their strength was not high. Aside from Pamir, who had the strength of the sacred domain, Lieutenant Colonel P-Way, who was the deputy commander, only had the strength of a master. The ordinary officers were even weaker. Most of them were soldiers, and there were not many masters. It must be said that with such strength in the exiled continent, they would be killed by exotic beasts. However, these goblins had something different. Goblin tanks, a ground-to-ground combat tool, had 8 pairs of wheels and were covered in iron armor. The turret was equipped with 105mm rifled cannons with powerful firepower. It was driven by 2 goblins and powered by crystal energy. The Goblin helicopter was an aerial combat tool that could attack both the air and the ground. It was equipped with a Gatling 15mm heavy machine gun and anti-air and ground missiles. It was very agile and fast. There were also goblin cannons, goblin heavy machine gunners, goblin snipers, and so on. The goblins formed a mature and powerful military system. Their expertise in machinery far surpassed that of any other species. This was also one of the reasons why the goblins were able to gain a foothold in the mortal plane where there were so many powerful countries. The goblins were weak. Colonel Pamir, who had the strength of the sacred domain, was already one of the best in the Empire. He controlled the elite strength of the 75th Legion and was sent by the king to the exiled continent to carry out missions. At this moment, Lieutenant Colonel P. Wei saluted. Reporting to Commander, the 75th Legion of the Goblin Empire has been assembled. Please give your orders, Mem. Pamir nodded. In front of Lieutenant Colonel P. Wei, he regained the temperament of a superior. He turned around and smiled at Ron. Lord Ron, thank you for taking care of me along the way. I have finally returned to my own legion. Pamir saluted. As the commander of the 75th Legion of the Goblin Empire, I formally invite you to travel with me. Ron thought for a moment and quickly agreed to Pamir's request. Since they had the same goal, which was Bartlow's prison, why couldn't they travel together? Ron was about to speak when a strange thought suddenly appeared in his mind. It carried a powerful and cold aura, mixed with a trace of unfriendliness and even hostility. This aura was extremely dangerous. Ron's hair stood on end with a whoosh. At the same time, he quickly reacted. Who is it? Who's there? Come out. Hearing Ron's words, everyone in Noah's party tensed up. Even Colonel Pamir took a step back, one hand on his gun as he looked around nervously. He knew that some terrifyingly powerful beings could sneak up on them without them noticing. You have pretty good vigilance. I only breathed a little heavily. I didn't expect you to discover me. At this moment, a voice slowly and faintly sounded with a unique magnetism. Immediately after, a ball of black mist appeared in front of Ron, and an abnormally pale, young, and strange face slowly appeared. A necromancer? Ron's expression changed. He hadn't expected that the one who suddenly appeared would be a divine necromancer like him. He wore a black necromancer's robe, and a black hood covered his head, revealing a young, bewitching, and pale face. Just like Nicole, this person was an undead from the mortal plane. Seeing an undead, Ron's heart warmed, and he felt an indescribable sense of familiarity. The divine necromancer glanced at Ron and narrowed his eyes, but he didn't express anything. At this time, he looked at Pai Weian and said with a trace of dissatisfaction, Mr. P. Wei, I think I've already told you that we have no other choice but to go to the planar prison of Bartlow's. If we continue to waste time here, it won't be a good thing for either of us. Yes, Mr. Klein, I understand this point, but P. Wei's expression was somewhat awkward. He glanced at Pamir and stammered. Our commander, Colonel Pamir, has already returned. Commander? Colonel Pamir. The one called Klein frowned. He lowered his head slightly, and his high collar covered half his face. In other words, you've already lost command of this army? The young man called Klein looked deeply at Pamir. He knew that this goblin's position was higher than P. Wei's, and his expression revealed a trace of dissatisfaction. Then, Lieutenant Colonel P. Wei, our cooperation is meaningless. Klein will take his leave now. Wait a moment, Lord Klein. Pamir called out just as Klein was about to leave in a huff. Pamir already knew from P. Wei that this undead divine magus called Klein was a lone adventurer who wanted to return to the mortal plane through the passage to the planar prison of Bartlow's. P. Wei also learned of the Red Silk Army's plot from him. Klein stopped in his tracks. Pamir had his own considerations as well. He showed a friendly smile. Lord Klein, just as you said, we have a common goal. With a powerhouse like you joining us, I believe that we'll have more power to deal with the ancient guardians of Bartlow's prison. Hearing Pamir's words, Klein hesitated. That's right. Since the Red Silk Army's treasure has been proven to be a complete lie, we can only choose to return. However, based on the current situation, we should unite and work hard to open up the passage to the planar prison of Bartlow's. That's right. Otherwise, who would want to stay in this godforsaken place? Pamir smiled as he spoke. That's right. As the commander of the 75th Army of the Goblin Empire, I invite you to join us. During our cooperation, all the warriors of the 75th Army will be in charge of everything." Pamir smiled and turned to Ron. "This is Lord Ron. He's a necromancer, just like you. You cultivate in the same element, so I believe you'll have some common topics." "Hello, Lord Klein." Ron bowed slightly and took the initiative to greet him. He was humble, and he could sense that the other party was no weaker than him. Klein glanced at Ron and nodded indifferently as a form of greeting. He then said proudly, "Lord Ron, what race are you from?" "I'm a human." Ron said, "A human." Klein's brows furrowed slightly before he smiled. "For you to be able to cultivate necromancy magic to this level as a human is already pretty good. But it's a pity that you'll never be able to unleash the full potential of necromancy magic. Why?" Ron asked curiously. This was the first time he'd heard such an argument. "Because you're a human." Klein had already lost interest in talking to Ron after saying this. He flapped his black robes and disappeared from the spot. At this moment, his indifferent voice sounded in the air. "Mr. Pamir, as far as I know, countless adventurers are already on their way to the planar prison of Bartolos. If you can't make the best use of your time, then you'll have to face those powerful ancient guardians alone." "Yes, Lord Klein. We'll set off immediately." Pamir saluted, his voice filled with respect. At this moment, Frigga came closer to Ron and frowned. "Ron, why do I feel that this guy is very arrogant? Are all necromancers from the main plane so arrogant?" Ron shrugged helplessly. "Perhaps he's very strong?" Firth also came over and whispered, "Ron, I don't seem to be able to see through his strength. Tell me, if you were to go against him, who would be stronger?" Ron pondered for a while before shaking his head. "I don't know. I've never fought against a necromancer of the same level before." "That means you don't have the confidence to deal with him." Firth looked at Klein's back in the distance and muttered to himself, "This guy is troublesome after all. I don't know if it's just my imagination, but I feel that he seems to be hostile towards us." Chapter 757. Noah's group continued on their journey. The only difference was that this time, they had an elite goblin army of tens of thousands. They were carrying all kinds of heavy weapons. Apart from that, there was also a special character, the mysterious divine necromancer from the main plane, Klein. Along the way, the performance of the 75th Goblin Army was an eye-opener for everyone in Noah's group. These goblins, who weren't very powerful, drove terrifying battle machines. They opened a path for them and built bridges for them. A series of standardized and formal procedures made all the armies blush with shame. Soon, they arrived at the planar prison of Bartlos. From the outside, the planar prison of Bartlos looked like a huge castle. The walls were made of the hardest meteor stones. Some of the mottled walls were already peeling off. The huge walls, which were hundreds of meters tall, stretched for dozens of miles. They were filled with a sense of history. In front of that huge castle, all living things seemed especially small. Outside the huge planar prison of Bartlos, a large group of people had already gathered. They were adventurers from the various major planes, as well as the main plane. There were many of them, at least a few 100,000 of them. As the various teleportation points had been destroyed, there was only one path left to return home. That was the planar teleportation point in Bartlos prison. The dark wooden door gave off a fierce aura. Behind the door was an unknown fate. It was like a ferocious beast that chose people to devour. This was the only way in and out of Bartlos prison. With the strength of the powerhouses, one attack was enough to blast open this heavy wooden door. However, even though the path home was right in front of them, not a single one of the hundreds of thousands of people released even the slightest bit of magic to blast open this weak wooden door. The reason was simple. Who knew what would come out after breaking open this wooden door? It should be known that Bartlos prison was a taboo of the various major planes. It was filled with danger and countless traps. It was also guarded by powerful ancient guardians. No one was willing to throw their lives away. Instead of risking their lives to fight the ancient guardians, it would be better to wait for a powerful adventurer or an adventurer team to step forward and open the door with great power. They might even be able to open a passage to the Bartolos plane, allowing them to return to the major planes without any worries. It was because of this mentality of waiting for others to charge in and take advantage of the situation that these hundreds of thousands of people stopped in front of the planar prison of Bartolos. They quietly waited for the powerhouses they were waiting for to appear. Unfortunately, after waiting for so many days, not a single powerhouse or adventurer team appeared to break open the door to Bartolos prison. They were all watching. The Goblin Empire's 75th Legion also arrived at the outskirts of the planar prison of Bartolos. They stopped and quickly found a suitable place to set up camp. After a while, they started to get busy. Countless goblins shuttled through the camp. They were like precision instruments. They set up their tents, cooked their meals, and did whatever they needed to do. Everyone followed the procedures to the letter. It was as if they had rehearsed it countless times. In just a short while, dozens of large tents were erected. They were arranged neatly, and every tent was of the same size and design. The distance between them was even. It was more accurate than using a ruler. The living area, the entertainment area, the war zone, the various areas were strictly separated, as if they were as precise as a machine. Ron and Pamir stood facing each other in a small hill not far away. From this angle, they could see the entirety of Bartolos prison. However, at this moment, Ron's gaze fell on the camp of the 75th Gnome Legion on the plains below the hill, and he remained silent for a long time. Pamir, your army is the best army I've ever seen. No one can compare to it. After a long while, Ron sighed and retracted his gaze. His eyes were filled with envy. I'm flattered by your praise, but why is that? Lord Ron, a smile appeared on Pamir's face. Because your army gives me the feeling of being organized, united, and orderly. It's like. At this point, Ron scratched his head, not knowing how to describe it. At this moment, a thought flashed through his mind, and he blurted out, like ants. After saying this, Ron felt a little regretful. He secretly glanced at Pamir and saw that his expression was normal. Only then did he feel a little relieved. You're right, Lord Ron. Pamir was not angry, but a serious expression appeared on his face. He laughed bitterly. In the main plane, we goblins are indeed as insignificant as ants. It's because we goblins are weak that no matter how much we train, we can't become true powerhouses. We have no choice but to rely on technology to develop powerful combat machines and systematize military training methods. Only then can we gain a foothold in the main plane where powerhouses are everywhere. At this point, Pamir let out a silent sigh. However, compared to those powerful main battle armies, we goblins are simply too weak. Main armies? Hearing this, Ron's heart trembled. He thought of the invasion of the Burning Legion. The powerful expeditionary force was only a part of the Burning Legion, but it had almost caused the entire continent of Noah to fall into a state of eternal damnation. This showed how powerful the main armies were. Ron hesitated for a moment before asking, the main plane? What kind of place is it? The weak are prey to the strong, and the weak are eliminated. Pamir summed up the cruelty of the main plane with these words. The strong rule over everything, and the weak only have the fate of being conquered. There are countless powerful races living in the main plane. Some of them rise like the sun, shining brightly in all directions. Some fall like meteors, forgotten by people. Pamir turned his head and stared into Ron's eyes. This is the main plane, a cruel one. If you don't live in glory, you die in darkness. The main plane. Ron's thoughts drifted into the distance. He wanted to ask Pamir how the undead were doing in the main plane. Did the Scourge still exist after the death of the Lich King, Hermes? However, Ron swallowed his words. For him, the most important thing now was to return to the Noah continent's secondary plane as soon as possible. After all, the matters of the primary plane were too far away for him to deal with. Right, when do we enter Bartolos prison? Ron asked. He was a little anxious and helpless. The planar passage was already in front of him, but he couldn't go back. Let's wait first. Pamir smiled. Do you know why they're waiting outside? They're not fools. Ron muttered to himself and understood what Pamir meant. I understand. This is the difference between planting peaches and plucking them. Those who entered first would have to deal with all sorts of dangers in order to open the planter passage. They might even be surrounded by large groups of ancient guardians. Those who entered later would not have to face these dangers and would be much safer. Then we can only wait. Ron smiled helplessly. He hadn't been home for 6 or 7 years. He didn't know if his wives were waiting anxiously. As the two conversed, Ron's gaze gradually shifted downwards. At this moment, a familiar figure came into view. Isn't that Klein? Ron saw Klein's figure in a half-open shrub below. It's him. Pamir nodded. He also recognized the familiar figure. A necromancer wearing a black robe like Ron was too rare in the exiled lands. Ron's eyes narrowed. No, it's not just him. It seems like there's someone else. At this moment, Klein had already entered the shrub. At this moment, a tall, burly man emerged from the forest and started talking to Klein. Who's that guy? Pamir asked. He had never seen that guy before. His eyes were filled with doubt. I don't know him. Ron shook his head. At this moment, Ron and Pamir could see that the two of them had already started talking. As they were too far away, Ron and Pamir could not hear what they were saying. What's going on? This guy Klein, didn't he say that he was a lonely adventurer? But it seems like they've known each other for a long time. Pamir muttered to himself. I don't know. Maybe he met a friend. Ron shook his head. It doesn't seem strange. That's true. Pamir nodded slightly. Who didn't have 1 or 2 friends when they were out? The two of them chatted for a while. At this moment, the burly man who was talking to Klein did something that Ron and Pamir did not expect. He pressed his hand to his chest and knelt on one knee on the ground, bowing to Klein. Ron and Pamir were slightly taken aback. After all, this was not an ordinary gesture in the main plane. The two of them looked at each other and could see the shock in each other's eyes. This guy called Klein seems to be acting a little strange. I'm afraid his background is not as simple as he said. Pamir's expression darkened as he spoke. That's right. This doesn't seem like something a lonely adventurer would do. It seems like Klein's subordinate is pledging loyalty to him. Ron said in a low voice. I have the same feeling. Pamir nodded slightly. Chapter 758. What? You're saying that those fellows are afraid of death? After hearing App's report, Klein's brows furrowed. Yes, our people have been hiding in the crowd. It's been a few days, but these fellows don't even dare to enter the main gate. Apps answered honestly, kneeling on one knee. These cowards, they've ruined my perfect plan. Klein was so angry that he almost couldn't help but curse. However, he quickly calmed down and lowered his head to think for a while. Then, he looked up, his eyes shining. This can't go on. Looks like we have to take some action. Seeing that Klein and the mysterious man had parted ways, Ron and Pamir lost interest in observing. Ron patted Pamir on the shoulder. Let's go, Pamir. Let's take a look at the front. Below the main gate of Bartlow's prison, countless black heads surged. However, these people were all quietly observing, and no one dared to break in. There's so many people here. Ron and Pamir walked among the crowd. As they had waited for many days, a small village had formed here. All sorts of tents had been set up, and it was like a slum in the city. Yes, there are hundreds of thousands of people here. Pamir nodded and said, many of them are like my 75th division. They've received missions from various realms before coming here. By the way, Lord Ron, are you here too? Pamir smiled at Ron. No, I'm not. Ron smiled. Our team is here to train in the exiled land. We didn't know about any treasure missions before coming here. Then you're really unlucky to have encountered such a thing, Pamir said with a smile. Ron smiled nonchalantly and looked around. It's a pity that although there are many people here, no one dares to step forward and break the main gate of this prison. If it were you, would you do that? Pamir said with a smile. Sacrifice yourself to light up the path for others? Even if you're willing to do that, others won't thank you. Ron hesitated, lowered his head, and thought for a while. Then he answered seriously, I would. Pamir laughed heartily, but he didn't think much of it. However, At this moment, Ron secretly made up his mind. If no one made a move for a while, he would be the first to break the door because he really couldn't wait any longer. A young man who looked like a thief was talking to himself on the wide stone bridge at the main gate of the planar prison. He couldn't help but show a trace of anxiety on his face. The thief was from the Dark Shadow clan. He was an expert on the level of a killing god. He had been here for several years and was one of the first adventurers to receive a quest to search for treasures in the exiled land. Now that he knew that he had gained nothing, he had to return as soon as possible. F***CK. They were all cowards. It's been so many days, yet no one dares to go in first. The anxious thief couldn't help but curse loudly. As he cursed, he pointed his middle finger at the gate of Bartlow's prison as if he wanted to vent his anger. F***CK. Who are you talking about? The bandit's actions caused the other bandit to be dissatisfied. He stood up and said, "Well, what do you think we are? Cowards, right? Since you're so strong, why don't you go in first?" The one who accused the killing god of the Dark Shadow clan was another Nether Knight from the Abyss clan. He pointed at the killing god of the Dark Shadow clan and said in a mocking tone, "Haha, I was wondering who it was. So it's the Nether Knight from the Abyss." The killing god of the Dark Shadow clan said with a fake smile, "As everyone knows, I'm only a thief. It's not my turn to be the vanguard. But you, Abyss Knight, as a noble Nether Knight, you have the most powerful defensive skills and recovery aura. If you don't go in first, do you want me to?" The Abyss Knight laughed. "It's normal for a thief to go in first. Who doesn't know that the Dark Shadow clan who live in the dark have the innate ability to hide? I think you're the most suitable person to go in first." After saying that, his face turned fierce. "You're calling someone a coward? I think you're the coward." F***CK. Say that again if you dare. After days of being in a difficult situation and being deceived, the Dark Shadow thief's anger finally exploded. The killing god and the Nether Knight were both experts in the divine realm. When both sides were about the same strength, friction naturally occurred. Say it then. Who's afraid of who? The Abyss Knight didn't care about the killing god of the Dark Shadow at all. He sneered. Then listen carefully. I'll say it again. You're a coward. Whoosh. The Dark Shadow thief's figure disappeared from the spot. The Abyss Knight's heart trembled. A strong murderous intent enveloped his entire body, causing all his hair to stand on end. "Be careful." There was a cry of alarm from behind. A shadow quickly appeared behind the Abyss Knight. A white dagger flashed with a cold light and stabbed at the Abyss Knight's back. "Go to hell." The Abyss Knight was prepared. His eyes flashed and a powerful domain exploded. The aura covered his entire body. "Stop fighting, stop. Calm down." The battle between the two affected the surroundings. However, they were quickly pulled apart by the others. "Damn, you're lucky." The shadow killing god was pulled to the side. He cursed and spat on the ground. Then, he glared fiercely at the other party, threatening them. The Abyss Knight didn't mind and laughed. "It's fine. As long as you think it's convenient, I'll accompany you." The disturbance disappeared just like that. However, at this time, the pressure in everyone's hearts was even more intense. They were filled with uneasiness and impatience. Ron and Pamir chatted as they walked. They were rushing back to the Gnome Empire's 75th Legion camp. At this time, there was a commotion not far behind them. Pamir turned around and was stunned. "Ron, look, what's that?" A figure suddenly appeared in front of the huge stone bridge in Bartlow's prison. The figure was wearing a black robe. His entire face was buried deep in the collar. No one could see his face clearly. He floated in the air and emitted an invisible pressure. Ron was stunned. That figure was none other than the divine necromancer Klein that he had just seen. Although he couldn't see his face clearly, the necromancy energy he emitted was all too familiar. "It's Klein," Ron exclaimed. "What's he trying to do? Who's this guy? He looks like a necromancer." "Necromancer? What's he trying to do? Is he trying to break through the gates of Bartlow's prison?" "Stop joking." "Him? What can necromancer do?" Klein's appearance instantly became the focus of everyone. For a moment, everyone started whispering. Other than some surprise, there was even more disdain. At this time, Klein smiled coldly. He opened his mouth, and his cold voice spread to every corner. "Ha, pathetic, cowardly, useless cowards. You think you can solve the problem by waiting here? How foolish." The moment Klein opened his mouth, he offended everyone present. "Damn it, who do you think you are? Get down here, bastard. You're just a necromancer. Why are you acting all high and mighty, scram?" In an instant, the area below Bartlow's prison was in an uproar. The sounds of quarreling were endless. Pamir took a deep breath. "This guy's a little strange. Is he trying to—" Ron's gaze froze as if he had thought of something. He exchanged glances with Pamir. Both of their eyes were filled with shock. Klein didn't mind the waves of criticism. He smiled slightly. "It's a pity that I'm leaving. If you like it, then continue to wait here. Stupid pigs." As he spoke, he slowly raised his hand. A black mass of air continued to revolve around it. At this time, Klein moved. He turned around and waved his arm towards the gates of Bartlow's prison. A small black dot of light was rapidly approaching, and immediately after, there was a loud bang. Chapter 759. Klein's actions stunned everyone. The hundreds of thousands of people stood there dumbfounded, the entire place silent. Klein looked down coldly before turning around and leaving, quickly disappearing into the pitch-black gates of Bartlow's prison. "Oh, that necromancer went in. Haha, there's finally a door-breaker. Quick, let's follow him." Everyone seemed to have woken up from a dream. They swarmed onto the stone bridge like a swarm of bees, majestically heading towards Bartlow's prison. Ron and Pamir looked at each other in shock. "There's something wrong with this guy." Pamir's expression darkened. "Yes," Ron nodded. "I'm starting to suspect his identity." Ron didn't say it out loud. He suspected that Klein was a member of the legendary Red Silk Army. "Let's go as well. We won't be able to catch up to the main group if we're late," Pamir said anxiously. The crowd in front of Bartlow's prison had mostly left in a mere 15 minutes. The 75th Army of the Goblin Empire quickly left after receiving the order, majestically following behind the group. Ron and Noah's groups also packed up and left. Dark, cold, and damp. The Bartlow's planar prison was 18 levels underground. Every level had its own independent space, and the size of this space was unimaginable. The interior of Bartlow's prison was a large space. There was a large cave that was dozens of meters tall, and the magic lamps on the ceiling flickered with a weak light. Hundreds of thousands of people stood in a large and spacious plaza, but it still seemed spacious. If this was an ancient tomb that contained great wealth, it might have attracted some people's interest, but at this moment, everyone was anxious to return home. "What's wrong? Where's that guy? He disappeared as soon as we came in, that bastard." The moment they entered the Bartlow's planar prison, the divine necromancer Klein disappeared without a trace, leaving behind hundreds of thousands of adventurers in the spacious plaza, not knowing what to do. "Where's that guy?" Pamir looked around and asked in a low voice. "He's already hidden." Ron frowned. He discovered that he could not sense Klein's aura. Zap, zap, zap. At this moment, a mechanical sound broke the silence of the square. It was extremely ear-piercing in the midst of the chaotic crowd. "What is it? What's that sound?" The sudden sound frightened everyone in the square, and the crowd began to panic. Swish, swish, swish. At this moment, countless iron pipes suddenly extended from the top of the cave, and the dark mouth of the cave was aimed at the people below. Out of his soldier's sensitivity, Pamir's hair stood on end. "Be careful. The mechanism has been activated." Pamir's warning came a little too late. At this moment, the metal pipes at the top of the cavern suddenly spat out countless tongues of flame, which rained down on the square below. Tap, tap, tap. Countless magic bullets rained down with dazzling speed and powerful penetrative power. The stronger players could only block them for a short while the weaker ones died on the spot. Wah, wah, what is this? Run, it was chaos. Hundreds of thousands of people were thrown into chaos. In that moment, all sorts of halo powers and defensive abilities were activated. The magical beasts in their human forms also began to transform. Whitebone Shield. Ron chanted an incantation, and not long after, A shield that was as translucent as white jade was summoned to block the attack of the light bullets above. However, he soon discovered, to his horror, that under the countless bombardments of the light bullets, terrifying cracks had appeared on the sturdy white-boned giant shield. Ron sucked in a breath of cold air. The power of the bullets of light falling from the sky had far exceeded his expectations. Boom! 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 Countless bullets of light rained down on the plaza. In that moment, the entire plaza had turned into a slaughterhouse. The crowd was trampling on each other, and cries and screams could be heard everywhere. "Ron, what we do now?" At this moment, Frigga squeezed to Ron's side. At this moment, she had already transformed into a golden fairy dragon. She flapped her small wings, and her beautiful big eyes were filled with anxiety. Although she had raised an energy shield, it was still unable to block the terrifying bullets of light. Under the attacks of the bullets of light, the energy shield's power was gradually dissipating. "There's no other way. We have to charge through," Ron roared. "Let's go. We have to keep moving forward. If we wait any longer, we'll only die." Frigga nodded. "Let's go." Dozens of figures dashed out quickly, running towards the depths of Bartlow's prison as fast as they could. The short distance of a few hundred meters was as difficult as climbing the sky for Ron. The bullets of light raining down from the sky, the chaotic crowd, and the blood and corpses all over the ground. All of this was like a battlefield to everyone. At this moment, the others also reacted. They knew that they would die if they retreated, so they could only brace themselves and run for their lives. Countless people rushed forward crazily, converging into a rolling stream of people. At this moment, no one cared about each other. As soon as the crowd rushed past the deadly square, a long corridor appeared in front of them. At the bottom of the corridor were countless stone steps, extending straight down like a flight of stairs. There was no end in sight. The fleeing people panicked and did not know where to go. Soon, they reached the top of the stairs and rushed down desperately. Ron was surrounded by the crowd. He could not help but run forward. At this moment, he felt his feet sink as if he had stepped on something. He was shocked. At this moment, the whole corridor seemed to come alive and became bright. Fire! Fire! The crowd became frightened. They saw a raging fire suddenly appear on the ground, burning the whole corridor red. Screams came from the crowd. The knights used the anti-fire halo skill to protect their teammates. "Hurry! Hurry up and rush over!" Ron panicked. He seemed to hear a sizzling sound under his feet. A burning smell filled the air. He immediately quickened his pace. At this moment, Ron seemed to hear someone call his name. He turned around and saw that it was Pamir. He was sitting on a goblin tank, reaching out to help him. "Lord Ron, hurry up and get on." Ron did not hesitate. He reached out and jumped onto the tank. The goblin tank roared, and the exhaust pipe at the back made a tut-tut sound. The heavy tracks of the tank suppressed the flames and accelerated forward. It was Ron's first time sitting on a goblin tank made of steel. He sat on the tank's wide turret. He felt that it was fast and stable. The armor was tough and impervious to fire and water. He was impressed that the goblins could design such a powerful battle machine. It was said that in addition to its tough armor, it could also defend against magic attacks. "This thing is not bad." Ron praised sincerely. Pamir smiled. His smile was full of pride. "If Lord Ron likes it, I can give you one." Ron smiled and waved his hand. "No need. I don't know how to use this thing, even if you gave it to me." In the spacious square of Bartlow's prison, there was no one left except for the countless corpses on the ground. Fresh blood flowed all over the ground, and the air was filled with the smell of blood. The corpses that had been blasted into pieces by the light bombs were strewn all over the ground. Their eyes were wide open, and they were filled with unwillingness. At this moment, a cloud of black fog slowly seeped out, revealing a pale face. It was the divine necromancer Klein. His eyes swept across the corpses on the ground, and a cold smile appeared on his face. "Master!" A voice came from the darkness, and the ground trembled slightly. A burly man slowly walked out. It was the armored ape Apps. Apps smiled. "I didn't expect the Bartlow's prison to be so powerful." Even the experts of the divine realm can't resist its power. Klein grunted. He had been here before and knew about the mechanisms here. He had long found a place to hide. Otherwise, even he might not have been spared. It seems that too many people have died. Apps looked at the corpses strewn all over the ground and frowned. Lord Klein, will this affect our plan? It won't. Klein answered straightforwardly. Those who died were too weak. Even if they didn't die, they would become a burden to us. Apps nodded and looked at the dark hole in front of them. Master, what do you think we should do? Klein's eyelids lifted slightly, and he said in a low voice, Have the brothers been settled? They've been settled. They're all waiting outside for your orders. Apps answered honestly. That's good. Klein nodded satisfactorily. He had always been confident in App's abilities. He pondered for a moment. Then, let them have a good rest. Wait for my orders. Apps was shocked. Master, are you saying that you don't need us to go in with you? There's no need, Klein said without thinking. Bartlow's prison is full of traps. It'll be inconvenient to bring too many people with me. Since those guys have fallen into our trap, I'll go in alone. But, Master, Apps said worriedly, you're alone without anyone to help you. No, I'm not doubting your abilities. I'm saying, let me bring a few brothers and serve you. He, who says I don't have anyone to help me? Klein waved his hand and laughed coldly. At this moment, his pitch-black eyes emitted a demonic green light, and it was unusually dazzling in the dark. Clack, clack, clack. In the spacious underground plaza, a bone-chilling sound came from the darkness. This. Chapter 760. With a swoosh, a bright light flashed, and an adventurer's head was cut off. The guy groaned as he clutched his headless neck and fell to the ground. Everyone's expression changed. They were all shocked. The mechanisms of the Bartlow's planar prison were too terrifying. It was impossible to guard against them. Of the hundreds of thousands of adventurers in the exiled lands, only a little more than 100,000 were left. In other words, more than 200,000 adventurers had already lost their lives in the Bartlow's prison. With such a high loss rate, it was no wonder that the prison was one of the most dangerous places in the exiled lands. Once these terrifying mechanisms were activated, even a divine powerhouse would not be able to resist. At this time, everyone had already arrived at a spacious hall. Wall lamps were hung on the walls of the hall, and the torches on the wall lamps were shining with faint blue flames. Although it was still abnormally gloomy, it was clearly brighter than the darkness from before. It should be safe here, right? Ron jumped down from the goblin tank and looked around hesitantly. I think we should be more careful. Due to the difference in strength, Pamir was far more cautious than Ron. He stayed on the goblin tank and did not come down. He only stuck his head out from under the turret. At this time, the goblin army not far away also arrived. Frigga, Firth, Undine, and the others also jumped down from the tank. Ugh, it stinks. Frigga frowned and quietly tidied up her clothes. To her, this goblin tank was good, but the space inside was too oppressive. This was not a small test for someone like her who loved cleanliness. At this time, the rest of the adventurers also came one after another. Their faces were still in shock. After confirming that this place was safe, they were relieved. Some drank potions, some healed, and some even cleared the negative status of their teammates. They were very busy. Ron spread out his spiritual sense to confirm his current position. When he found no abnormalities, he breathed a sigh of relief. However, at this time, he saw a familiar figure. Klein. Ron opened his eyes wide and stared at the familiar black robe. He was full of surprise. Why would this guy appear here? Ron's voice attracted the attention of others. For a moment, surprise, anger, fear, and all kinds of emotions were focused on Klein. Some could not even suppress the killing intent in their hearts and wanted to tear him apart, especially the adventurers who had lost their teammates. However, at this time, Klein looked very miserable. His robe was torn in many places and faintly stained with blood. He had one hand on his abdomen, and blood was slowly dripping from his hand. It seemed that he had suffered serious injuries. Klein's face was paler than usual. He slowly raised his head and looked at everyone's eyes. As if he understood something, he smiled bitterly. I'm sorry, everyone. I was knocked down as soon as I entered. It was not easy for me to escape. Ron quickly walked over and looked at Klein's wound. He found that it was caused by a light bomb. He nodded and smiled. It's good that you're fine. Later, I'll let my teammate, the Logia High Priestess Undine, heal you. Thank you. Klein smiled slightly, his eyes full of gratitude. It's nothing. Ron patted Klein's shoulder and smiled kindly. Welcome back. Ron and the 75th Gnome Legion accepted Klein, but this did not mean that the others would let him go. At this time, a tall barbarian stood up with a bang. His face was extremely distorted due to anger. Motherf asterisk Kerr, you caused the death of so many of our people. Do you think you can get away with a word of apology? The barbarian took out a long-handled axe and slammed it into the ground with a loud bang. A deep crack appeared on the hard stone floor. Looking at the barbarian in front of him, Ron sucked in a breath of cold air. Although this barbarian's strength was at mid-level god realm, not far from his own, the weapon in his hand was actually a divine artifact. The light of a divine weapon was more restrained than a holy weapon, but the power it exuded was more intense. The patterns inscribed on the axe flowed as if they were a whole, like a natural luster. Even in the main plane, it was not easy for a god-level powerhouse to own a god-level weapon. Most people only used holy weapons. Klein's smile gradually disappeared, replaced by a cold expression. He said coldly, "What do you want? What do I want?" The barbarian cracked a smile, his eyes fierce. "I want to kill you." "Haha, a guy with a divine weapon." Klein laughed dryly. "But it won't be that easy for you to kill me." "Then we'll see." The barbarian's face darkened. "Wait." Just as the two were about to draw their swords, a voice stopped him. It was Ron. The barbarian's eyes narrowed. "Ha! I was wondering who it was. You dare to meddle in my business. So, it's another necromancer. So what if I'm a necromancer?" Ron's face was as cold as water, a trace of anger faintly showing in his eyes. "Nothing?" The huge axe barbarian smiled. "Necromancers are just a bunch of trash. Since you want to interfere, fine, then come at me together." This time, not only Klein, but even Ron could not hold back. He quietly reached into his spatial bag and slowly took out a dragon bone staff. "Are we going to fight?" Seeing this, R.A. first smiled faintly and stood next to Ron. He said lazily, "Then count me in. I'm R.A. Firth the Dark Dragon." "And me?" Hao Qin also stood up. "I'm Beaumont, the Beaumont Behemoth." "And me," Undine said. "And me," Di Luo said. Ron's teammates stood up one by one. Every one of them was a mid-level God Realm expert. Standing together, their momentum was great. Even the colonel of the 75th Goblin Legion, Pamir, waved the white gloves in his hands. The goblin tanks started moving, countless black cannons aimed at that guy. The atmosphere in the hall suddenly became tense. The adventurers looked at each other blankly. They didn't know which side they should take. "You." The barbarian was so angry that his face turned red. Just now, his team had been at the forefront and had suffered the most casualties. Other than him, the captain, no one had been able to escape. Seeing that the other side was powerful, the barbarian naturally chose to remain calm. Although his actions seemed crude, in reality, his thoughts were extremely meticulous. Otherwise, he would not have become a captain. At this time, he glared fiercely at Klein and spat. "Tui." He threw out a sentence. "Count yourself lucky." Then he turned and strode away. The storm was finally resolved, but no one was happy for a while, especially Ron. He was still brooding over the barbarian's words. Necromancers are all trash. If this had been the Noah continent in the past, it would have been fine. But ever since Ron's Scourge Church rose like a meteor, no one dared to look down on necromancers. Necromancers also gained recognition with their unique and mysterious power. What was wrong with this world? "Thank you." Klein sincerely thanked Ron this time. With his strength, he was not afraid of the barbarian, but if they really fought, he would definitely expose his strength. This would cause his plan to change. Of course, Klein's injuries were self-inflicted. If not for this, he would not have been able to convince everyone. Life transmission. Undine inspected Klein's injuries and immediately used life healing. A green ripple of energy slowly rippled out, directly entering Klein's body. In a short while, the wound on Klein's abdomen had completely disappeared. Klein sighed in relief, secretly rejoicing. After all, the pained expression on his face just now was not an act. Ron looked at the huge Barclow's prison and began to worry. Pamir, I think we've already entered, but where is the teleportation formation we're looking for? Pamir shook his head. I don't know, it's my first time here too. It's in the lowest level of Barclow's prison's dungeon. Just when everyone was in a dilemma, a voice came from behind. The voice was so cold that it did not contain the slightest trace of emotion. Everyone turned around to see that the one who had spoken was the divine necromancer Klein. He smiled slightly, ignoring everyone's doubtful gazes as he said coldly, Don't ask me how I know. You just have to choose whether to believe me or not. There's nothing I can do if you don't believe me. Since Klein was unwilling to speak, no one forced him. After all, everyone had their own secrets, and it was normal for him not to want to speak. Ron muttered to himself for a moment before nodding. I believe you. Very good. Klein smiled and pointed forward. Barclow's prison isn't a maze. It's not complicated inside, and there's only one path that leads underground. However, the corners of Klein's mouth curled up slightly, a trace of coldness appearing on his face. Whether or not we can make it to the first level underground will depend on our strength and luck. Pamir tilted his head slightly. You're saying that we'll meet the ancient guardians of Barclow's prison? The moment the words ancient guardians were mentioned, everyone's expression changed. It had to be known that none of the guardians of Barclow's prison were easy to deal with. Moreover, there were many of them. If they really fought, their side would have no chance of winning. Chapter 761. The underground world was always pitch black, gloomy, and damp. The water droplets on their heads slowly dripped down to the ground. After tens of thousands of years, the water droplets had turned into stalactites that were as tall as a person standing tall on the ground. At this time, the two gray shadows slowly moved toward the place, stopping after a while. Not far away, Klein pointed to a few green figures at the side of the cellar for Ron to see. They're the primordial guards? Ron was surprised to see those strange people wearing long green robes that covered their entire bodies, even their faces. Klein and Ron were observing everything around them through the eyes of Spectre, so that they could see every movement of those people in green. That's right, they're the primordial guards of Barclow's prison. Klein's gaze never left those green figures for a moment. Sacred domain? Ron stared blankly for a moment, somewhat surprised. Those primordial guards weren't very strong, and were only at the early or middle stages of the sacred domain. Were they the primordial guards that made people pale at the mention of them? There's a total of 28 people here. Although they're only at the sacred domain level, don't underestimate them. It's only 28 powerhouses of the sacred domain. As Klein was speaking, he was interrupted by Ron, who smiled faintly. I'm confident that I won't let a single one of them escape. After all, there are over 100,000 adventurers following them, and there were even mid-level and even high-level god domain experts amongst them. However, all of these people had tacitly concealed themselves and didn't move at all, nor did they dare make the slightest sound. No, Ron, you're wrong. Klein gave Ron a strange look. These are just a few guards guarding a room in Barclow's prison. Although I don't know the exact number of primordial guard in Barclow's prison, I can be sure of one thing. The number of primordial guards on this floor is definitely not smaller than ours. So many. Ron sucked in a breath of cold air. Of course, every level of Barclow's prison is an independent space. We can only reach the next level if we pass through this level. Moreover, the strength of the ancient guardians on each floor isn't fixed. As the prison goes deeper and deeper, the prisoners guarding it will become more and more important. Their strength will also become stronger and stronger. There might even be mid and high-level God Realm Masters. You must be mentally prepared for this. This is the only way. We have to get rid of these guards as soon as possible and we can't leave any of them alive. Klein took a deep breath. Once they attract the ancient guardians from the other levels, we'll be finished. So, we have to think of a way to lure them here. Klein smiled at Ron. What do you think? Are you going, or am I going? Whatever. Ron replied with a smile. Anything is fine. Klein thought for a while. Then I'll go. But you have to kill them as fast as you can. Don't let any of them escape, understand? Everyone nodded to show that they understood. Klein glanced at them, and with a roll of his black robe, he turned into a cloud of black fog and disappeared. The 20 or so green-clothed guards were patrolling their territory like loyal machines. Their vigilant eyes swept over any suspicious places, not letting go of any blind spots. Who's there? At this time, the leading man in green suddenly raised his eyebrows and shouted sternly. A black shadow moved quickly with a swish and then disappeared into the darkness. Stop! Chase after him! The men in green were furious. They shouted loudly and chased after him one by one. They're here. Through the eyes of the specter, Ron finally saw that the 28 ancient guardians had been lured over without missing a single one. They were rapidly approaching. Everyone get into position and prepare for battle. Damn it, how can this guy run so fast? If I catch up to him, he'll die. The leader of the green-robed men cursed. At this time, they had already pulled out their weapons from under their green robes. It was a 1-foot-long scimitar. It was a sacred artifact, the blade of the guardian. The tip of the scimitar emitted a faint green light. Where's this guy? Where did this guy go? After a few turns, the black shadow disappeared. The men in green looked around. Something's not right. The leading man in green was more cautious. At this time, he seemed to have smelled a trace of danger. Unfortunately, his warning came a little too late. Do it, Ron shouted. He swung his arm and raised his staff high, and the necromancy magic in his hand blasted out. Frost Nova! A bone-chilling cold spread out, and the surrounding area was like an ice cellar. In just a moment, the 28 ancient guardians were completely frozen, unable to move. Kill! At this time, as though they were prepared, countless figures emerged from the darkness. Countless magic and long-range attacks came crashing down on them like raindrops. We've been tricked. The leading man in green's teeth chattered. At this moment, he felt that death was rapidly approaching. Boom, 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 without any warning, without any resistance. The 28 ancient guardians were instantly smashed into meat paste by more than 100,000 adventurers. They did not even have time to cry for help. Phew, the battle was finally over, and everyone heaved a sigh of relief. When Ron came back to his senses, he found that his palms were full of sweat. Well done. Klein's figure emerged from the darkness. He nodded slightly, and his cold eyes were filled with praise. After killing the guards in this room, the path on this level will be cleared. We'll have to move on to the next level. I want to emphasize that in the process of moving forward, do not provoke the other guards. As long as they don't block our path, if the situation permits, try your best to lure them over and kill them. Got it? Unknowingly, Klein had become the core of everyone. These people listened to his every word, and Klein's prestige in their hearts slowly rose. Using the method they had just used, the adventurers who broke into Bartlow's prison killed a few more batches of ancient guardians. Unknowingly, they had already reached the 10th level. From the 10th level onwards, many beginner and intermediate God-realm powerhouses had appeared, and the number had increased from dozens to hundreds. However, this was not a problem for the adventurers who were determined to return. Looking through the rooms, Ron saw that these individual rooms held prisoners. When these prisoners saw the adventurers, they all went crazy. They hit the iron bars in front of the room with all their might and shouted loudly. "Let me out! Let me out! Who are these people? Why are they locked up here?" Ron asked in surprise. You don't even know this?" Pamir looked at Ron with an expression that said he was an idiot. "My dear Mr. Ron, you don't even know this? You're too ignorant. Even if you don't know, shouldn't you at least think about where you are? This is Bartlow's prison, a place where prisoners are kept. Those locked up in cages are naturally prisoners. Prisoners, Ron was even more surprised. What crime have they committed? That I don't know. Pamir spread out his hands. Anyway, they've committed all sorts of crimes. As long as they're caught, regardless of whether they're from the main plane or the secondary plane, they're all locked up here. Oh, Ron nodded, not fully understanding. At this moment, he saw that the iron bars of the rooms were suffused with traces of azure light. It seemed that this was a magical formation with some kind of power and was not as simple as an ordinary iron cage. Otherwise, with the strength of these people, they would have already rushed out. Frigga looked at the prisoners and felt a little sorry for them. Their clothes were disheveled, and it seemed that they had suffered a lot. These people seem to have been locked up for a long time. Should we rescue them? No. Chapter 762. As Klein spoke, he slowly walked down the stairs. Arriving in front of a constantly spinning black vortex, he stepped into it without hesitation. This was the teleportation gate to Bartlow's prison. Passing through this gate would lead them to the next floor. Ron also stepped into this space, and with a flash of the black vortex, they arrived at the 12th floor. Upon arriving at the 12th floor, the entire space around them changed. This place was much brighter than the 11th floor, and the architectural style was more refined and dignified. There were no longer the crude stone walls and stalactites of the 11th floor. Instead, there was a stone wall carved with patterns. They went in, let's go. Hurry and follow. The other adventurers followed, Klein one by one, as if they were afraid that he would disappear again. Over 100,000 adventurers passed through the black vortex without exception. After passing through the black vortex, they arrived at a covered bridge. This bridge was 30 to 40 meters wide and could accommodate several dozen people. Beneath the bridge was water, and a faint blue light seeped out of the water, illuminating the entire passage. Everyone walked on the bridge cautiously, as if they were afraid that the bridge would sink. As he walked, he suddenly stopped in his tracks with a solemn expression. "What's wrong?" Ron asked. "Did you hear something?" Klein asked in a low voice, his eyes narrowing. "No." Ron listened attentively for a moment before casually replying. But in the next moment, his expression turned to one of shock and even a hint of fear. Rustle, rustle, rustle. A faint sound came from the end of the covered bridge. It was very soft at first, but it slowly grew louder and louder. Before long, the entire adventurer team heard it, and they immediately panicked. "What's wrong? What's that sound? Something's rapidly approaching." It was getting clearer and clearer. There was no need to listen anymore. The entire covered bridge could feel the intense vibrations. Frigga, Undine, and the other female experts of God's realm were so shocked that their faces paled. "It's a large group of ancient guardians." Klein sucked in a deep breath, gritting his teeth. "They're here." In an instant, the dim covered bridge suddenly brightened up. The dark blue light reflected on the surface of the water, illuminating the surface of the water. Green figures appeared one after another like ghosts. Countless black heads occupied the space around the covered bridge. Ancient guardians, so many. Heavens, why are there so many of them? So strong. I see high-level God Realm Masters. High-level God Realm Masters? We're finished. Being surrounded by so many ancient guardians without any warning, all the adventurers were stupefied. Fear and panic spread in their hearts. Freyja's teeth were chattering as she stuttered. Ron, if we tell them, we're just using the spatial tunnel to go back and have no intention of becoming their enemy, do you think they'll let us go?" "Let's give it a try." Ron gritted his teeth, speaking in a clear voice. "Friend from Bartlow's prison, we are adventurers from the banished lands, from various planes. We have no intention of offending you, but it's a pity that all the transmission arrays in the banished lands have been destroyed. We have no choice but to borrow Bartlow's prison's transmission array. I hope everyone can make an exception." Ron's voice spread far and wide, making sure that everyone here heard him. However, the several 100,000 ancient guardians were like machines, coldly looking down. The eyes that peeked out from under their green robes did not contain the slightest trace of emotion. Silence. The entire area quieted down, so quiet that even the sound of a pin dropping could be heard. Everyone on the covered bridge held their breaths, as if they were prisoners on death row awaiting trial. An invisible pressure spread out, as if there was a giant boulder above everyone's head. Everyone's back was drenched in cold sweat. Whoosh. At this time, a green figure stood out from the crowd. He seemed to be the leader of these people, nodding slightly and speaking in a cold and emotionless voice. Trespassers of Bartlow's prison will be killed without mercy. As soon as the green figure finished speaking, countless crossbows were raised, the cold tips of the arrows aimed at the people on the covered bridge. Not good, run. In an instant, the adventurers were like birds startled by the twang of a bow. Ron's heart sank to the bottom in an instant. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Countless arrows rained down, and the sound of arrows piercing flesh could be heard. On this narrow bridge, the adventurers couldn't even dodge the arrows and fell to the ground one after another. The situation was like a one-sided massacre. The arrows on the crossbows were coated with poison. Those who were lightly hit would lose their ability to resist, while those who were heavily hit would die instantly. Don't get entangled with them. Hurry and get out. Ron anxiously roared. The adventurers took out their weapons one after another, countless halos lighting up one after another. The sounds of slaughter echoed on the covered bridge. Ron's group was at the front of the group. He took the lead and rushed out, but before he could run a few steps, a green figure appeared in front of him. Another group of ancient guardians had blocked the exit. We're surrounded. Ron's heart sank. He finally understood that they had been targeted and had been waiting for a trap. Break out. Break out. Kill our way out. Everyone understood and didn't hesitate to kill their way out of the encirclement. The green figures took out their weapons from under their robes and jumped down one by one, turning the small covered bridge into a battlefield of slaughter. Blood dyed the ground red and flowed to the underground river under the covered bridge, reflecting the entire surface of the water red. Kill! 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 Everyone's eyes were red from the killing. Some couldn't even tell if they were teammates, partners, or ancient guardians. Everyone was close to going crazy. Roar! At this time, the dark dragon R.A. Firth couldn't hold back and transformed into his true form with a loud roar. The huge dark dragon's body took up most of the covered bridge, constantly flapping his wings and stirring up strong winds. At the same time, Hao-Chin, Di-Luo, Frigga, and the other magic beasts also transformed. Facing the dangerous magic beasts that had transformed, the green figures weren't afraid at all. They pounced forward and greeted the magic beasts with spells, arrows, and swords. Boom! Boom! Frost Dragon. Ron summoned more than a dozen frost dragons in one go, and countless frost descended, filling the entire passageway. At this time, the other divine, Magus Klein, also summoned a frost dragon, but he only summoned one. The frost dragon, summoned by Ron, quickly became the target of the ancient guardians. Countless spells and arrows bombarded the frost dragon. Gah! A short while later, the frost dragon let out a loud roar and turned into a puff of black smoke, disappearing. These green-robed men were different from the ones Ron had encountered before. They were all mid-level God Realm masters and above, each of them possessing formidable strength. When the adventurers went up against them, whether it was strength or numbers, they were at a disadvantage. The situation was getting worse and worse. Screams came from Ron's surroundings. More than 100,000 adventurers were either dead or injured. They could not organize an effective resistance and were quickly slaughtered. Their corpses fell into the water with plop, plop. Water flowed down Ron's cheeks and reached his forehead. It was hard to tell whether it was sweat or blood. He only knew that he was desperately waving the dragon bone staff in his hand. One after another, green figures fell into a pool of blood. Chapter 763. At this time, a delicate cry came from not far away. It was Frigga, who was absent-minded and was suddenly shot by an arrow. The powerful impact slammed her hard against the wall. Frigga! Ron was shocked and immediately rushed over, reaching out to help Frigga. What happened to you? Frigga's injuries were serious. The true body of the fairy dragon disappeared and turned into the appearance of a young girl. At this moment, her face was abnormally pale and painful. Poison. There's poison on the arrow. Ron looked down and saw that Frigga's chest was dyed red, but the wound was slightly black. It seemed that the poison had already taken effect. Frigga, hang in there. Ron took out a bottle of antidote from the space bag, opened the bottle cap, and pointed the mouth of the bottle at Frigga's cherry lips. Gulp, gulp. She drank it. But surprisingly, after drinking the antidote, Frigga still showed no signs of improvement. She frowned and looked painful. What's going on? Ron was stunned. He held the empty bottle in his hand and stared blankly at Frigga, who was about to faint. He was at a loss as to what to do. At this time, the nature high priestess Undine came over and carefully examined Frigga's injuries. She squatted down and pressed one hand on Frigga's abdomen, chanting. At this time, the place she pressed her hand on emitted a trace of green light. After a while, Frigga woke up. What's going on? Ron asked. It's plant poison. Undine turned her head. This should be people from the life main plane. Like me, they cultivate the power of nature. Power of nature. Ron was a little stunned. Are they elves? They are not elves, but they should be related to elves. Undine pondered for a moment. I feel a familiar aura from them. At this time, countless arrows shot towards Ron and the others. Ron immediately raised his white bone shield to block, while Undine also used her life shield. These ancient guardians would not show mercy just because she also cultivated the power of life. At this time, R.A. Firth had also been beaten into his human form. At this moment, his face was covered with blood, and his black robe was damaged in many places. In Ron's impression, he had never seen him in such a sorry state. We can't stop them. There are too many of them. Let's rush out, said Firth as he wiped the blood off his face. Undine immediately treated him. Can we rush out? Ron's brows were tightly knitted. He found that the situation was getting more and more serious. Countless people in green began to transform. One by one, they turned into 30-meter-tall tree ants. Their roots were deeply embedded in the ground, and the earth energy in their hands formed into boulders that constantly shot out. These were the true forms of the ancient guardians. The defense that the adventurers had just formed was immediately broken into pieces. These adventurers were practically a motley crew that had been put together at the last minute. Their strength was uneven, and their attacks were also disorderly. Even if there were one or two powerful figures, they could not form an effective defense. Under the attacks of the ancient guardians, they suffered heavy casualties. On the other hand, the Gnome Empire's 75th Legion quickly formed a powerful defensive formation. With the gnome tanks as the periphery, the Black Cannons continuously fired their vengeful cannons at the ancient guardians. However, Ron also discovered that there were many powerful figures among the adventurers. Their attacks also dealt heavy damage to the ancient guardians. For example, the divine necromancer Klein. Although he had only summoned a single frost dragon, this frost dragon's attack, defense, and destructive power far exceeded the dozen frost dragons that Ron had summoned. So, numbers alone aren't enough. Ron's heart trembled. At this moment, he seemed to have understood something. It was as if there was something that he wanted to grasp, but could not grasp. What am I thinking? The most important thing now is to kill our way out. Ron shook his head and calmed his chaotic thoughts. He instantly focused his mental strength, and with the Dragonbone staff in hand, he joined the battle. However, as time passed, the balance of the battle slowly shifted towards the adventurers' side. After all, they were all fugitives who had experienced hundreds of battles. After the initial panic, they quickly calmed down and organized an effective counterattack. Countless spells flashed on the covered bridge, and the sounds of battle shook the heavens and the earth. On a protruding rock at a high point of the covered bridge, a tall man dressed in green silently watched the battle below. His brows were furrowed. Lord Warden, the battle situation doesn't look good. Our casualties are too heavy. A man dressed in green, who looked like a subordinate, bowed to the tall man dressed in green. I know. I have eyes to see, the tall warden in green said. At this time, he raised his head slightly, and a glimmer of light flashed in his eyes. Who gave these guys such courage? How dare they break into the Bartolo's prison that we are guarding? They don't take us, the powerhouses of life, seriously. As he spoke, he slowly put down his hands that were crossed in front of his chest. His hands were very thin, so thin that they were just skin and bones. They emitted a wood-like luster. The man dressed in green took a step back, slightly shocked. He knew that the Lord Warden was about to personally take action. No matter what the reason is, they deserve to die. The Lord Warden bellowed. At this time, his body suddenly grew larger. Countless leaf-like arms spread out from his body, and an incomparably powerful life force filled the entire space. In an instant, a huge pressure descended, causing everyone present to freeze. Everyone looked up and saw a huge tree floating in the middle of the air, its power shaking the heavens and the earth. What is that? What a powerful life force. The adventurers were stupefied, but in the next moment, their faces were filled with fear. It's a high-level God Realm Master. High-level God Realm Master. Without a doubt, the fear in their eyes stemmed from the other party's terrifying strength. High-level God Realm. A high-level God Realm Master, even in the main plane, was an overlord, an extremely terrifying existence. The moment he decided to take action, it crushed most of the adventurers' courage and confidence. Quickly run, No one knew who shouted, but in an instant, the organized resistance of the adventurers collapsed, while the ancient guardians took the opportunity to chase after them. High-level God Realm Master. Ron sucked in a breath of cold air. This wasn't the first time he saw a high-level God Realm Master. Even among the adventurers, there were quite a number of high-level God Realm Masters, but this was his first time seeing a high-level God Realm Master in action. Ignoring the strength, just the momentum alone was enough to shake heaven and earth. What a powerful life force! Undine gripped the emerald green staff in her hand tightly, envy written all over her face. The Lord Warden transformed into a giant tree, standing proudly in midair, looking extremely strange. Amidst the dense forest, a pair of blood-red eyes peeked out. At this time, the Lord Warden sneered coldly, slowly stretching out his giant arms. Zap, zap. While Ron was still in shock, he felt the ground beneath him begin to shake. In the next moment, countless tiny roots reached out from the ground, slowly creeping upward from his feet. Not good, it's twisting roots. Ron's heart skipped a beat. He had seen Undine use this skill before, but its power couldn't be compared to this high-level God Realm Master in front of him. Ron took a deep breath. Reaching out, a sharp bone spike appeared in his hand, cutting off the roots coiling around his feet. Although these roots were small, they looked extremely tough. It took Ron a lot of effort to cut them off, but these annoying roots would grow back again. What Ron didn't know was that the skill this green-robed man used wasn't the life force skill, twisting roots, but root domain. Anyone caught within the root domain would be tightly bound by these roots, unable to move. The worst thing was that these roots had countless tiny spikes growing out from them, easily piercing into flesh and injecting fatal toxins. At this point, some high-level God Realm experts among the group of adventurers couldn't hold back anymore. Although the root domain was powerful, it couldn't do anything to them. These people flew out from the group, roaring in anger as they pounced on the warden that had transformed into a giant tree. Humph, you don't know life from death. Besieged by more than a dozen high-level God Realm Masters of the same level, the green-robed man, called the warden, merely sneered in disdain. His giant body that was as big as a house shook violently, his arms slightly raised. At the same time, some cryptic words came out from his mouth, filling the entire space. His voice was low and powerful, like the whispers of a lover or the singing of a lark. It's the ancient elven language. These words didn't sound like much to others, but in Undine's ears, it was like a sudden clap of thunder. That voice sounded like the call of an old family member, stirring her up. That's right, it's the ancient elven language. These ancient guards must be related to the elves. Go to hell. While the Green Robe Man was chanting, more than a dozen high-level God Realm experts were already in front of him. All kinds of weapons were raised, slamming down on the warden. After chanting the last syllable, the warden that had transformed into a giant tree opened his eyes. A sharp light shone from them. Chapter 764. In the blink of an eye, the sky was filled with dark clouds. No, these weren't dark clouds, but a powerful domain force, brimming with a majestic life force. Amidst the thick clouds, faint traces of green light could be seen. That was life force. Life force brimming with life force spread out. Even the surrounding space was filled with vitality. At this time, a meteor streaked across the sky, akin to countless lightning bolts falling from the sky. Not good. The several high-level God Realm Masters besieging the warden cried out in alarm. Those who knew better retreated in haste, but unfortunately, it was too late. Countless meteors rained down, as if they had eyes of their own, ruthlessly bombarding the adventurers, creating earth-shattering explosions. Boom! 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 The entire covered bridge quaked. The undercurrent under the bridge splashed water, and the energy in the air collided with each other. The high-level God Realm Masters besieging the warden were smashed deep into the ground. The first wave, the second wave, countless meteors rained down mercilessly, akin to a meteor shower. The strong quickly activated their defensive abilities, while the weak died on the spot. Ron stared blankly at the scene before him. At this moment, he felt his hands and feet turning cold. The other party was just too powerful, not to mention himself, a mere mid-level God Realm. Even a high-level God Realm would be as fragile as paper in front of that green-robed man who had transformed into a giant tree. A slight pinch would turn him into dust. Life force, the power of the God of Life. In the eyes of mortals, this was an insurmountable gap. Walala! Finally, the meteors raining down from the sky stopped. The ground that was bombarded by the Life Force's meteor shower was a mess, whereas the covered bridge was smashed into pieces. Pieces of debris fell into the water, splashing water everywhere. There was no one left standing on the covered bridge. After the terrifying domain skill, the ground was covered in rivers of blood. Corpses piled up like mountains. Some had already sunk to the bottom of the water, becoming food for the fishes and shrimps. The green-clothed warden also returned to his human form from his tree form. His expression was still calm, as if he had done something insignificant. Just now, more than 100,000 adventurers had been annihilated by his terrifying domain skill. With just this one move, more than 100,000 corpses had been added to Bartlow's prison. Of course, some of the adventurers were still alive. They had managed to hide in a relatively safe position before the skill was activated, and were lucky enough to save their lives. Ron, what are you waiting for? Why aren't you leaving? The rumbling noises around Ron snapped him out of his daze. He looked up and saw Colonel Pamir of the Goblin Empire's 75th Legion. He was sitting in a sturdy goblin tank with only his head exposed. The goblin tank's sturdy armor had been blasted full of holes, and its high-speed engine was spewing large amounts of smoke. Pamir's 75th Goblin Legion was almost completely wiped out. His second-in-command, Pivian, was killed in the first wave of attacks. The goblin tank he was riding on became a live target, falling apart under the bombardment of countless meteors. Go! Ron knew that this was his only chance. He grabbed Frigga, who was beside him, and ran away as fast as they could. The others also seized the opportunity and fled in all directions. At this time, the green-clothed warden's gaze fell on Ron. He frowned slightly, and there was a trace of disgust in his eyes. With a swish, the green-clothed warden's figure disappeared from the spot. Seeing the green-clothed warden suddenly appear in front of him, Ron took a step back in shock. Frigga, on the other hand, was so frightened that her face turned pale, and her delicate body trembled uncontrollably. Not only did Ron not understand, even Fu Lijia couldn't wrap her head around it. On this spacious covered bridge, there were so many people trying to escape. Why did the most powerful high-level God Realm Master set his sights on him, as if he was specifically looking for trouble. That's right. The life energy that the warden cultivated and the death energy that Ron cultivated were natural enemies. The green-robed man was especially sensitive to the aura of those who cultivated the death energy. Therefore, he instinctively felt a sense of disgust, as if he had to kill Ron as soon as possible. Necromancer. The warden smiled faintly. He stretched out a finger, beckoning Huang Xiaolong. Come, I'll give you a chance. A chance? Ron knew that this wasn't a chance to let them go, but a chance to attack. Of course, after the attack, whether they would live or die, only the heavens would know. Ron clearly saw the deep killing intent in the warden's eyes. Very good. At this point, Ron also threw caution to the wind. He slowly raised his hand. A long bone spear appeared in his hand. Gritting his teeth, Huang Xiaolong pierced the bone spear at the warden. In an instant, the bone spear in Ron's hand froze, unable to pierce any further. The sharp bone spear was tightly gripped in the warden's hand, unable to move an inch. You're too slow. The green-robed warden calmly stared at Ron and said word by word, a powerhouse who cultivates in the energy of death. Is this all you've got? You disappoint me. After saying that, he shook his head and suddenly used all his strength to lift Ron up high with one hand. Then, he threw Ron away with all his might. Pong! Ron's body slammed into the wall. The sharp pain from his back nearly made him faint. But at this moment, a smile appeared on Ron's pained face. Go to hell. The warden showed no mercy, condensing a green light in his right hand as he prepared to kill Ron. But at this moment, the situation suddenly changed. The bone spear in the warden's hand flew out of its own accord, shooting towards the warden like an arrow. The warden was shocked. He didn't expect the other party to have such a move. Because they were too close, by the time he reacted, it was already too late. The bone spear stabbed into his abdomen, piercing deep into his flesh. Not good. This thing is poisonous. The warden was shocked and angry. He was shocked because he had been too careless, and angry because he didn't expect the other party to be so insidious. He immediately held his breath and used his life force to drive out the poison that had invaded his body. Ha! Ron wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth and smiled. He had once thought of summoning the strongest Frost WYRM to fight, but he immediately rejected the idea. The reason was simple. The other party was too powerful. No matter how many Frost WYRMs he summoned, it would be futile. Only by using strategies would he have a chance of survival. On the surface, it looked like Ron was using the most ordinary bone spear, but the tip of the bone spear was a poisoned bone dagger. The method of attack was also the most primitive, luring the other party into being careless and then killing him in one blow. Let's go. Ron took a deep breath and turned into a cloud of black mist. He wrapped up the frightened Frigga and quickly fled. The warden gritted his teeth. He ignored his injuries and forced the life force in his body to move. He stretched out his left and right hand, and in an instant, an irregular black stone appeared in his palm, spinning. You want to leave? Not so easy. The warden's eyes flashed, and he aimed the black stone at Ron's back. Ron, behind you. Ron was in the midst of fleeing when he heard a voice behind him. He turned around and was scared out of his wits. He saw a black stone rapidly closing in on him, exuding a powerful life force. This power gave him a feeling of invincibility. It's over. Ron closed his eyes, his heart sinking to the bottom. Just as he was in despair, a huge black shadow suddenly appeared and blocked his path with lightning speed. Boom! The black stone heavily hit the black shadow, and a loud explosion broke out. Ron opened his eyes, and his eyes almost popped out of their sockets. Pamir. At this critical moment, Colonel Pamir drove the last goblin tank and blocked the warden's attack, buying time for Ron to escape. The goblin tank's turret was blown to pieces by the black stone, and large amounts of flames burned fiercely. A figure climbed out of the cockpit. It was Pamir. His body was now covered in flames, and his exposed skin was charred. Pamir moved as if he wanted to break free from the flames, but he quickly stopped. His injuries were too serious. He looked up at Ron and smiled, then fainted. Pamir. Pamir! Ron charged at Pamir like a madman, reaching out and pulling him out of the flames. Only then did he realize that Pamir's legs were broken, and there was no part of his body that was still intact. Pamir groaned and slowly woke up. Seeing that it was Ron, he was slightly shocked. Ron, you're still here? What are you doing? Why aren't you running? No, I won't leave you behind. If we're leaving together, Ron roared, reaching out and carrying Pamir on his shoulder. Put me down. Let me die. My brothers from his 75th Division. You. Ron, let me go. Let me die. Let me go down with them. As Pamir spoke, he began to cry. Under the meteor fall, his entire 75th Army had been wiped out. He was the only one left alive. Pamir had already lost the courage to continue living. You, give me, shut up. Ron's eyes were red. He carried Pamir on his back and quickly walked away. Damn it. The warden sat down heavily with a thud, panting heavily. He didn't expect the poison in the hidden weapon to be the most terrifying type, soul poison. The poison had already begun to invade his soul. Chapter 765. Ron carried Pamir on his back and pulled Frigga along as he ran for his life. After running for some time, he suddenly slipped and fell heavily to the ground. Phew! Are we safe now? Ron sat on the ground, gasping for breath, unable to get up for a long time. Pamir, who was on his back, also fell heavily to the ground, causing him to groan in pain. Ron carefully observed his surroundings. The environment here was different from before. It was like a huge space. The reason it was called a space was because it was incomparably vast. The ground was made of hard limestone, and he couldn't see the end of it. He didn't know which direction to go. Just as Ron was at a loss, a soft groan came from the ground. Pamir, are you all right? Ron was shocked. He hurriedly helped Pamir up, only to discover that Pamir's legs were broken from the knees down. Deep white bones could be seen. I'm fine, Pamir smiled bitterly. I accidentally broke them when I came out. Ron was silent. He knew that Pamir's legs were blown off. If he hadn't driven the goblin tank to block the terrifying attack of the green-clothed guard, he wouldn't have ended up like this. I'm sorry, Ron said softly. He could only express his apologies. At the same time, he reached for the portal bag at his waist. Suddenly, he realized that the health potions he brought were gone. Ron turned to Freyja and said, Madam President, I've used up all the health potions I have on me. Do you have any more? Frigga also searched her portal bag. She shook her head. I'm sorry, Ron. I've also used up the health potions I brought. That's troublesome. Ron also felt that this was a little troublesome. If he had health potions, Pamir's legs would heal in an instant. But he didn't have any. Did he have to carry him all the way back? At this thought, Ron missed nature's high priestess Undine. If only she was here, Pamir's injuries wouldn't be a problem. But now, besides him and Frigga, everyone else was nowhere to be seen. Who knew if they could survive the attack of the green-clothed man's meteor fall domain? Ron glanced at Pamir. When he came out of the goblin tank, he was empty-handed. He didn't have any health potions on him. Ron still felt guilty towards Pamir. After all, Pamir had saved his life. No matter what, Ron's life was a good thing. If he had a choice, he wouldn't have to face the green-clothed man. Wait. At this moment, Freyja thought for a moment. She reached into her pocket and took something out of it. I brought this with me when I came here. Ron, do you think I can use this? Frigga took out a wheelchair with 4 steel wheels. The chair was wrapped in soft fur, and the armrests were decorated with wood grains. It looked very luxurious. Ron nodded. It's all right. Just make do with it for now. She then helped Pamir up and placed him in the wheelchair. She then smiled at Freyja and said, Thank you, Madam President. Frigga's face turned red when she met Ron's gaze. She lowered her head shyly. No need. Because it was dark, Ron didn't see Frigga's expression. He pushed the wheelchair himself. Let's go. Frigga's expression darkened, and she felt a little disappointed. She didn't know when she started to have feelings for this human man who was younger than her by a few years. When she remembered that he was her fiancé, Frigga's face turned red. However, Ron's chairman pulled her back to reality. Frigga looked at Ron's back and sighed. Forget it. He already has 3 wives. Why should I join the fun? She shook her head and quickly followed. Ron didn't know where to go. He could only instinctively push the wheelchair forward while talking to Pamir. Pamir didn't seem to be in a good mood, and he responded half-heartedly. Frigga followed behind silently, thinking about her own matters. Suddenly, Ron stopped in his tracks. Frigga was distracted and almost bumped into Ron. Ron, what's wrong? Frigga asked. Ron didn't answer. He looked around sharply. Who's here? Come out, it's me. As soon as Ron said that, a figure walked out from the darkness. Ron looked closely. Who else could it be but Klein? Klein, it's you? Why are you here? Where are the others? Ron asked in surprise. Klein shook his head. I don't know. I ran away when the life domain appeared. I don't know if they could escape. Ran away first? Hearing this, Ron's brows furrowed slightly, suppressing a trace of anger in his heart. But on second thought, he was relieved. In that kind of situation, wouldn't one be a fool if they didn't run away? Even a high-level God Realm Master wasn't that Green Robe Warden's opponent. What more Klein? Although he didn't know Klein's strength, he couldn't be much stronger than Ron, right? Thinking of this, Ron sighed helplessly, shaking his head. Forget it, let's go first. If they can't escape, then we can only resign ourselves to fate. The life of an adventurer was full of helplessness. Even a God Realm Master was no more than an ordinary person in front of a stronger force. Pamir wasn't as open-minded as Ron. He stared intently at Klein as though his eyes were about to spew flames of anger. Klein glanced at Pamir, smiled slightly, and turned his head away, unconcerned. Out of more than 100,000 adventurers, only a few were left after being besieged by the ancient guards of Bartolo's prison. Thinking of this, Ron couldn't help but feel a little sad. He silently prayed that his teammates could escape by luck. All right, what floor are we on now? Ron took a few steps forward, asking Klein behind him. Klein pondered for a moment. If my guess is correct, we've reached the 14th floor. 14th floor. For more floors, and we'll reach the bottom of Bartolo's prison. Is there really an interplanar transmission array there? Ron was fascinated, his face burning with passion. Of course there is, Klein hurriedly said. Bartolo's prison is a place to imprison prisoners. We can't escort prisoners from other places and have to walk back, right? Klein's confident tone cleared Ron's doubts. He nodded. All right, let's go. Under the covered bridge, the warden in green sat cross-legged on the ground with his eyes closed. The divine power of life covered his entire body, and the muscles on his face twitched in pain. Soul poison wasn't that easy to get rid of. It was more terrifying than ordinary poison, but with the help of the divine power of life, the poison that invaded the soul was finally removed. After a long time, he finally opened his eyes and stood up with a swoosh, letting out a long cry. Lord Warden, Lord Warden! The ancient guards appeared around the warden like ghosts, kneeling down and saluting him. Although the warden's expression was wooden, he couldn't suppress the flames of anger in his eyes. Passed down the order, the warden took a step forward, his 5 fingers twisting together. Search the entire Bartolo's prison. No matter where these fellows escaped to, find them and kill them. Yes, the green-clothed ancient guardian answered loudly. At this time, an ancient guardian hesitated for a moment before saying cautiously, Lord Warden, it seems that there has never been such a large-scale invasion in the history of Bartolo's prison. This matter is too big. Should we report it to Lord Guardian? Report it to the Guardian? Hearing this, the warden in green was clearly stunned. He then shook his head. No need. There's no need to trouble Lord Maxwell with such a small matter. Chapter 766. Klein, Frigga, and the rest walked on. Ron pushed the wheelchair while Pamir sat in it. Unknowingly, a black vortex appeared in front of them. The vortex spun continuously, and traces of spatial energy slowly seeped out. We've reached the 16th floor, Ron muttered to himself. He took a deep breath and stepped into the spatial vortex. The space distorted, and Ron's vision gradually became blurry. Suddenly, everything turned dark. Not long after, it slowly became bright again. The 16th floor of Bartlow's prison was another world. It was a huge underground cavern that was hundreds of feet high. Faint blue light shone down from the ceiling of the cavern. A wide underground river flowed slowly from the side, and the sound of water echoed in the huge underground cavern. "This is the 16th floor?" Ron looked around as he walked. After a while, he could not help but ask, "Why don't I see any of the prisoners?" There were many prisoners on every floor of Bartlow's prison. Some of them were locked up in cages, while others were locked up in rooms with iron bars. Every time they walked past, these prisoners would desperately shout and beg Ron to let them out. Of course, Ron did not dare to do this. Klein had warned him that if these prisoners were released, they would immediately attract a large number of ancient guards. It was even possible that the terrifying warden would be attracted. From the 16th floor onwards, the prisoners here are no longer locked up in ordinary magic cages. They are locked up in another space that has been specially created. Klein raised his head slightly, his black eyes staring at the thick walls as if he could see through the contents of the walls. They're no longer ordinary prisoners. These people are powerful and extremely vicious. They have committed heinous crimes in the main plane, and even in the other major planes. Ron nodded. So that's how it is. Everyone fell silent, and the cave returned to silence. However, everyone, including Ron, was thinking of the same question. How does Klein know so much? They had reached the 16th floor of Bartlow's prison, which meant that they were only 2 floors away from the spatial passage to Bartlow's prison. Thinking that they would be able to go home soon, everyone became excited. Not long after, Pamir broke the silence. "Ron, what do you plan to do when you go back?" "Me?" Ron did not expect Pamir to suddenly ask such a question. He was momentarily stunned. After thinking for a while, he replied, "I don't have any other plans. I just want to go back and rest." Pamir smiled, as if he had already expected this answer. He turned his head slightly. "Lord Ron, if you are willing, I intend to invite you to the Goblin Empire. I believe that with your strength, you will definitely be placed in an important position by my king." Pamir's eyes revealed a trace of eagerness. After all, what the Goblin Empire and the main plane lacked the most was powerhouses. Although the Goblin Empire had an extremely large population, advanced technology, and an endless stream of war machines that could be activated at any time, powerhouses had always been a problem. The goblins were a race that was proficient in technology and not cultivation. They urgently needed powerhouses to join them. Ron was slightly stunned and shook his head. "I'm sorry, Brother Pamir. I understand how you feel, but I can't promise you now. After all, my family, my wife and son, are in the Noah continent." Oh! When Pamir heard this, there was disappointment in his eyes. However, he quickly expressed his understanding and smiled. "All right then, Brother Ron. If you have the chance to come to the main plane, you must visit the Goblin Empire. I want to take you to see the Goblin Empire's strongest, largest, and most advanced war machine, the Helicarrier. It's a huge warship that can travel on the sea and in the sky. It can carry more than 1,000 goblin planes. It's a magnificent sight." Pamir gave a vivid description of the situation. "Helicarrier?" Ron listened with fascination. He nodded. "All right, if I have the chance, I will definitely go." Ron and Pamir chatted as they walked. However, Klein, who was listening at the side, had a strange expression on his face. His eyes flickered as he stared at Ron from time to time. His heart was in turmoil. "Ron, this guy is actually from the Noah continent? Then this Ron is—" Klein glanced at Ron a few more times. At this moment, he recalled a piece of information he had received. In the Noah continent, there was an organization called the Scourge Church. They had once been glorious, then fell into decline. However, they rose again. They were different from the undead in the main plane. They worshipped the dead Lich King and established a powerful regime that combined religion and politics. Of course, the Scourge Church was a powerful force for a time. However, in the eyes of Klein, who came from the main plane, it was nothing more than a small matter. However, Klein had his own plans. "Right, Klein, where's your hometown?" At this moment, Ron pretended to ask Klein casually. Klein was walking in front. From Ron's perspective, he could only see the back of Klein. Klein did not reply. At this moment, he suddenly stopped in his tracks. "What's wrong, Klein? Let's go." Ron felt strange and urged. Klein did not reply. He slowly raised his head and calmly looked in a direction above the cave. Ron followed Klein's gaze. However, in the next moment, his face turned deathly pale. A figure in green had appeared above the cave at some point. His cold gaze swept over everyone below. The warden in green. When did he come? Why didn't anyone notice him? Ron's hands and feet were cold. His body involuntarily trembled. He would never forget how terrifying this person in green was. Although only the green-robed warden had appeared, his appearance had caused the atmosphere of the entire space to freeze. Ron. Frigga also noticed the warden. She took a step back in fright and hid behind Ron. Her delicate body couldn't help but tremble. Pamir's face was bitter. He knew that there was no way he could escape today. The warden in green looked at them coldly, as if he was looking at dead people. At this moment, a green shadow moved and he slowly descended. At this moment, Ron finally saw the appearance of the warden in green. He had a thin face and a tall stature. However, he was not muscular. On the contrary, he was somewhat thin and weak. His skin was bronze and emitted a glossy luster. Two green, sword-like eyebrows were raised high, and his expression was grave and stern. "You damned undead. You made me go through so much trouble to find you." The warden in green spoke slowly. As soon as he opened his mouth, it was filled with murderous intent. "But now you can't escape." Chapter 767. The warden stood there quietly, not in a hurry to make a move. Like a cat toying with a mouse, he continued to exert psychological pressure on Ron and Klein. The warden's hands hung down like withered branches, cold, killing intent spreading in the air. He instinctively loathed the aura of death emitted from the two. "Kill!" At this moment, Klein suddenly moved. He raised his left hand, and a green flame appeared in his palm. At the same time, he chanted a series of cryptic incantations. "What? It's actually a soul attack. Damn it." The warden didn't expect Klein to make the first move. In his carelessness, he almost fell for it. At this moment, he was both shocked and angry. Soul attacks were formless and not very powerful, but the method of attack was strange. No matter how strong one's body was, when the soul was attacked, it would be disastrous. If one's strength was too weak, they would either die or become an idiot. In the face of Klein's strange and sinister attack, the warden immediately activated his soul defense, nullifying Klein's attack in an instant. The two exchanged blows in an instant. To outsiders, it seemed like they didn't do anything, but Ron knew that they had already experienced a dangerous battle of the soul. Ron took a deep breath and prepared to join the battle. "Damn it, two necromancer worms. Do you think this kind of soul attack can do anything to me? I'll kill you." The warden was shocked and angry. He spread his green robes and released a powerful aura of life, determined to counterattack. Bone cage. Without waiting for him to make a move, Klein seized the opportunity again. His necromancy magic could be cast almost instantly, which Ron admired greatly. Instant necromancy magic sounded simple, but it wasn't easy to do it. It was based on a deep understanding of necromancy magic and the law of death. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Countless white bones suddenly extended from the ground like sharp claws, trapping the warden in the middle and wrapping him up layer by layer. A huge and complex bone cage of 3 meters tall was formed in an instant. The white, jade-like bones emitted a bright luster and surrounded him tightly. So powerful this guy, Ron was stupefied. He was astonished by Klein's formidable strength. At least, he was unable to do this. "Who?" Klein took a deep breath and turned his head to look at Ron, only to see him standing there in a daze, as if he was a fool. He became anxious and roared, "Ron, what are you still standing there for? Go, go. I can only trap him for a while." Ron snapped out of shock. He wanted to run, but the moment his hand touched Pamir's wheelchair, he changed his mind. He, Klein, and Frigga might be able to escape, but what about Pamir? No, Klein, I can't go. I won't leave Pamir behind. Ron shook his head and rejected Klein's request. He wanted to run, but he couldn't get far with Pamir. What? Klein was stunned when he heard this. He then cursed, F***, Ron, you idiot. You're willing to give up your life for a lowly goblin. Ron frowned. He turned his head and stared at Klein. To me, regardless of whether Pamir is a goblin or not, he's my brother, he said to Klein, enunciating every word clearly. Ron Pamir was moved. This strong goblin soldier couldn't help but cry. You. Intimidated by Ron's aura, Klein was speechless for a moment. He couldn't understand Ron's feelings for Pamir. Faced with the powerful warden, how could Ron not want to escape? But he couldn't leave Pamir behind and escape alone. Klein stomped his foot. Since you want to die, do as you please. With that said, with a pung, Klein's body transformed into a black fog and instantly vanished from the spot. Klein hadn't planned on fighting this powerful warden. His previous attack had only been a stall for time. With his ability, escaping from the warden was still possible. Ron, what'll we do? Frigga clung to him like a helpless little girl. She was afraid of the powerful warden. Pamir also said, Ron, hurry up and leave. Don't worry about me. I'm not afraid of death. My brothers are all dead. I want to accompany them. No. Pamir, I said that I won't leave you behind. Frigga pushed Pamir aside. I'll deal with this guy. Ron's gaze was resolute as he slowly took out the dragonbone staff. Ka! 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 At this time, a powerful life aura condensed. Ron knew that the warden was about to break free. Boom! Green branches stretched out through the cracks of the bone cage. The narrow space could no longer contain the huge figure, and the bone cage suddenly collapsed. A 10-meter-tall treant stood in front of Ron. He waved his arms, and countless branches shook like snakes. A powerful life force suddenly filled the entire space. Ron took a step back and raised the dragonbone staff in his hand. The dragonbone staff emitted a glaring light, and a black mist filled the air. In an instant, Ron's eyes turned cyan. Dragon hidden in hell, awaken, slumbering king. Your arrival has caused the heavens and earth to change color. Come out, frost dragon. Following an earth-shaking roar, a massive frost dragon emerged from the black fog, revealing its massive head, and a terrifying frost aura spread out. This time, Ron only summoned a single frost dragon. He poured all his soul force into it. This frost dragon was extremely powerful. This was something that Ron had learned from Klein. Sometimes, quantity wasn't necessarily more important than quality. Frost breath. The frost dragon opened its mouth and spat out a cold dragon breath. The cold dragon breath froze the huge treant, and even its movements slowed down. A layer of frost also condensed on its leaves. Oomph! Insignificant skill. The warden coldly snorted. His long branches shook and countless ice shards fell down. After saying that, he swung his huge arm and fiercely attacked Ron. Ron's body flashed and turned into a black fog, disappearing in the blink of an eye. Countless branches slammed into the ground, leaving a huge imprint. Boom! The treant's strength was immense. The place where Ron had just been standing had already cracked. Bone spear, frost nova, death coil. Ron kept moving his body. Countless undead spells and soul attacks rained down on the warden who had transformed into a treant. The treant's defense was indeed strong. Ron's attacks couldn't do much damage to him, but they angered him. He stretched out his hand, and a black stone appeared in his palm and kept spinning. Die! The warden's eyes flashed, and he threw the black stone at the frost dragon in the sky. Boom! A world-shaking explosion sounded out, causing countless rocks to fall from the ceiling. The black rocks hit the frost dragon, causing it to cry out in pain as it turned into a cloud of black fog and disappeared. The cold aura in the surroundings also disappeared. What? That's it? Ron was shocked. He had thought of failure, but he didn't expect it to come so quickly. In front of the warden, the powerful frost dragon couldn't even last a minute. Ugh! Ron felt his chest tighten, and he spat out a mouthful of blood. His mind was connected to the frost dragon, and his soul was inevitably damaged when the frost dragon disappeared. The warden laughed coldly. He clenched his hands, and a huge amount of life force burst out in an instant. Entangling roots. At this time, Ron felt something moving under his feet. He looked down and was shocked. He didn't know when, but his legs had been entangled by countless root-like things. He couldn't move at all. Ron immediately used bone spurs to cut off these annoying things. Unfortunately, they seemed to be endless. As soon as he cut them off, they immediately grew out and entangled him. Not only that, but countless vines also stretched out around him and wrapped around his body. No. Ron's arms were also entangled. He couldn't cut off the roots, even if he wanted to. He struggled with all his might, but there were more and more roots, and they were getting tighter. Ron, Pamir, and Frigga cried out in shock. Anyone who was not blind could see at a glance that Ron was about to lose. "Your Excellency, Fairy Dragon, don't worry about me." "Run," Pamir said anxiously to Frigga. "Ron is no match for him. If you don't run, we'll die." I can't go." Frigga's eyes were red. Ron had risked his life to fight the warden in order to protect them. How could she leave alone at this time? At this time, the warden, who had transformed into a giant tree, laughed. "Lowly worms, prepare to die. On account of your courage, I might as well leave you with an intact corpse." With that, the warden raised his right hand high. His arm, which was as thick as tree branches, slammed down on the immobile Ron. Ron's heart sank. At this moment, he could only watch helplessly as the warden's giant hand came slapping down. "It's over." Ron sighed in his heart and closed his eyes in despair. Boom! Suddenly, there was a loud bang. The warden, who was more than 10 meters tall, tilted and fell heavily to the ground. Ron opened his eyes and saw a familiar figure. He couldn't help but exclaim in surprise. Chapter 768. When Klein returned, Ron, Frigga, and Pamir were pleasantly surprised. "You're such a troublemaker. I had no choice but to come back and help you." Klein's lips curled into a sinister smile. "What did that life-type bastard say? That we necromancers are lowly insects? Very well. I'll make you change that arrogant face of yours very soon." After saying that, Klein pulled out a magic staff from somewhere. This staff was about a meter long and was completely black, almost transparent. It was covered in scales, and at the top was a sinister snake head. The snake head opened its mouth wide and spat out a blood-red tongue. The entire staff emitted the light of a holy weapon. This was the high-ranked holy weapon of necromancers, the nether snake staff. It had an additional bonus when using plague and poison skills. "Awaken, dragon hiding in the abyss. The door to the underworld has opened. Decaying bones are the symbol of courage. Your appearance has plunged the world into fear." As he chanted, Klein summoned another frost dragon. The frost dragon roared, emitting a bone-chilling aura. "Well done, Klein." Ron looked and was greatly shaken. He laughed heartily. "Let's show this guy the power of necromancers." Saying that, he waved his dragonbone staff. Not long after, another huge frost dragon appeared in front of the warden. The two frost dragons roared continuously. The surrounding air had already dropped to 0 degrees, and the low puddles on the ground were all frozen. Faced with the threat of the two frost dragons, the warden didn't care at all. He smiled coldly, and the leaves on his body rustled. "Ha! You want to deal with me, with just the two of you? So what if I say it? You necromancers are trash, and necromancers of the necromancers are even more trash among trash." Scram! Klein and Ron were enraged. They waved their staffs, and the frost dragons roared and pounced. Boom, boom, boom. The two frost dragons launched an attack at the warden in a ferocious manner. In an instant, countless frost dragons descended and completely froze the area within a few dozen meters of the warden. At this moment, Ron finally understood why Klein only summoned one frost dragon. It was because in a one-on-one battle between a necromancer and an enemy, the strength of a frost dragon would not change greatly because of the number of enemies. On the contrary, because there were too many frost dragons, they would often use their instincts to fight. But when only one frost dragon was summoned, the situation was different. Necromancers could not only control the frost dragon's skills, speed, and direction, but they could also control each of its movements. Their control was very precise. The frost dragon was just like the necromancer's hands and feet, nimble and flexible. Seeing that Ron had already understood everything, Klein nodded slowly. That's right, Ron. When necromancers fight one-on-one, precise control is more important than numbers. Ron nodded and cast a grateful look at Klein, silently engraving his words in his heart. In a dark and spacious underground cavern, the warden, who cultivated in the power of life, and the two necromancy divine magi, Ron and Klein, who cultivated in the power of necromancy, were engaged in a life and death battle. Neither side could withdraw from this battle, including the warden. If he let the two escape from the heavily guarded Bartolo's prison, what awaited him would be the severe punishment of the ancient dragon, Maxwell. Powerful auras of life and death intertwined, causing waves of turbulence in the spacious cavern. The power of the powerhouses surged in all directions, causing the earth to shake. Countless rocks fell from the ceiling of the cavern. Klein and Ron used curses, soul attacks, summoning, and other necromancy spells. The two of them cooperated and fought brilliantly. For a moment, they were in a deadlock with the warden. Frigga and Pamir hit on one side. Pamir was the weakest, only having the strength of the sacred domain. Coupled with the fact that he could not move freely, he trembled in fear from the powerful force. Frigga was also shocked to the point that her face turned pale. She was also a divine powerhouse, but the difference between her and the two was too great. They're too strong. Frigga's lips curled into a bitter smile. She was the chairman of the council who could call the wind and summon the rain on the Noah continent. But in the land of exile, she was only a small character. She could not even participate in the battle between Ron, Klein, and the warden. Her participation would only be a burden. Pamir sighed. Yes, I didn't think that the necromancy magic would be so powerful. It's really not simple to be able to fight a life magic powerhouse to a draw. Frigga was stunned. She looked at Pamir, and a strange look flashed across her eyes. She could not help but ask, from what you've said, it seems that the necromancers have always been weak. Are they not powerful enough? Pamir sighed and explained, in our opinion, the necromancers are of course extremely powerful. However, among the major forces in the main plane, the necromancers are the weakest. The weakest? Frigga did not understand Pamir's words. In her eyes, necromancy magic had already demonstrated its strength. How could such a powerful force be the weakest? Could it be that the other forces in the main plane had even more powerful forces? Frigga did not understand. She wanted to ask further, but Pamir shook his head and did not say anything else. Freyja had to swallow the question back into her stomach. As a life magic powerhouse, he had enough strength to be proud of being chosen as the warden of Bartolo's prison. However, now that he was being suppressed by two insignificant necromancers, he was rather annoyed. The two little fellows were simply too annoying. One attacked, one covered, one retreated, one brought up the rear, one was injured, and one healed. Their seamless cooperation, terrifying necromancy magic, and strange attack methods gave the warden, who was many times more powerful than them, a headache. He roared, "You damned, evil necromancers, go to hell." As he spoke, a majestic life force seeped out of his body. The warden's arms shook, and a black stone quietly floated between his withered palms. "Be careful, he's going to throw the stone." Ron was shocked and immediately warned. He was still fearful of the power of those black stones. Retreat. Klein's heart tightened. He did not care about the bone spear that he was about to throw out, and immediately ordered the frost dragon to retreat. The frost dragon seemed to have smelled a trace of danger. It desperately flapped its huge wings that were filled with the smell of decay, and its huge body quickly retreated. Haha, do you think you can escape? A glint flashed in the warden's eyes, and the black stone in his left hand was thrown out. As it flew, the apple-sized black stone grew larger and larger. In an instant, it became a terrifying sphere with a diameter of more than 10 meters. Boom! A loud sound like the mountains were collapsing, and Ron's frost dragon was tragically smashed into pieces by the black stone thrown by the warden. It turned into a cloud of black fog and disappeared into the air. Klein's frost dragon suffered the same fate. It was quickly killed by the black stone thrown by the warden's right hand, and turned into ashes before it could even cry out. What kind of skill was this? It was too powerful. A small black stone was like the nemesis of the frost dragon. The powerful and terrifying frost dragon, the most powerful undead creature, could not withstand a single blow from this small stone. In other words, even if they summoned another frost dragon, the outcome would be the same. This feeling made Ron and Klein so depressed that they wanted to vomit blood. A necromancer who did not summon undead creatures was like a commander without an army. Not only could they not guarantee their own safety, but their strength was also greatly reduced. As a matter of fact, Ron began to summon again. Terror Knight, Skeleton Warrior, Skeleton Magician, Ghoul. Ron summoned a large number of undead creatures in one breath. In an instant, countless undead creatures crawled out from the hardened soil. They were a black mass, roaring and waving the weapons in their hands. There were at least tens of thousands of them. When the warden saw this, he laughed heartily. As expected, undead creatures are undead, and trash is trash. You dare to summon such weak, undead creatures to make a fool of yourself? With a wave of his green robe, the warden casually sent out a stream of air filled with a powerful aura of life. When the undead creatures came into contact with this green stream of air, they immediately turned into a cloud of black smoke and disappeared. In an instant, more than half of the tens of thousands of undead creatures that Ron had summoned disappeared. Damn it, Ron wanted to continue summoning, but was pulled back by Klein. Don't summon these low-level undead creatures. These things have no effect on true powerhouses. Klein looked at Ron, somewhat speechless. I really don't know who taught you necromancy magic. You're already a divine necromancer, yet you still summon skeletons to fight like an ordinary necromancer? Klein's gaze was fixed on the warden in green, his eyes bursting with deep disgust. He took a deep breath. Unless it's a large army battle, never use the skeleton C tactic. Those meaningless and large numbers of low-level undead will consume a large amount of your soul force. When your soul force is exhausted, you'll die a miserable death. Ron quickly calmed down and asked Klein, then what should we do now? Although the frost dragon is powerful, its movements are too slow. If we want to defeat this guy, we have to summon this thing. As Klein said this, he opened his mouth and chanted an incantation. Ron listened carefully, not leaving a single word of the incantation in his mind. To him, this was a strange yet familiar incantation. It was strange because Ron had never heard this incantation from Homeland's mouth. It was familiar because its summoning method was somewhat similar to summoning skeletons. Klein's voice grew louder and louder. He waved the nether snake staff in his hand, and a powerful aura of death descended in all directions. As his soul force filled up, his body slowly floated up, and his pitch-black eyes turned green. Come out, skeleton sovereign. As Klein's last syllable fell, a strange demonic wind suddenly blew on the flat ground. A huge black fog appeared out of thin air and quickly condensed. Not long after, a 10-meter-tall skeleton giant stood in front of the two. What kind of undead magic is this? Ron was stunned. He stared blankly at the huge skeleton in front of him that he had never seen before. He saw that it was covered in hard, heavy armor, and its whole body was wrapped in hardbone armor. It wore a skull mask on its face, revealing only a pair of black holes. It wore something like a crown on its head, with a huge ruby inlaid in the middle. It held a huge scepter in its hand, and the skull at the top of the scepter was fierce and dazzling. The appearance of the skeleton sovereign was like the arrival of a noble king, exuding a strong, kingly aura, which attracted the many skeletons summoned by Ron to worship it. Chapter 769. A skeleton with the strength of the divine realm. Ron looked and was shocked. The strength of the huge skeleton in front of him was not something that ordinary skeletons or even Black Knights could compare to. It actually had the strength of the divine realm. At this moment, the skeleton emperor moved. It raised its long scepter high. Not long after, a red light penetrated down and opened up under its feet, forming a strange red shape. A red halo also appeared under Ron's feet. At this moment, he felt his injuries slowly recovering. Evil halo. It actually added an evil halo to itself and us. This guy isn't simple. Ron took a deep breath. He was even more curious about the strength of the skeleton emperor. The skeleton emperor had already pounced on the warden. It took out a huge shield from somewhere and held a two-handed scepter in its other hand as it fought with the warden. The warden growled, and the leaves on his body began to shake. Not long after, countless soft branches extended from his arm and swept towards the skeleton emperor. The skeleton sovereign used its shield to block. Its defense was surprisingly high, and it was able to withstand the warden's sweep. At the same time, it immediately launched a counterattack. The strength of the skeleton emperor lay in its terrifying combat strength and strong defense. In addition to its endless combat skills, it could be called the king of skeletons. It could even summon a large number of ghouls, skeletons, and other undead creatures to fight. This is basically an undead paladin. Ron looked at the skeleton emperor's battle, and this feeling emerged in his heart. At this moment, Klein spoke. As he commanded the skeleton emperor to fight, he said to Ron, "Ron, hurry up and summon the skeleton emperor. The two of us will work together and fight this damn guy. Damn, this guy's life aura is too annoying." The green-clothed warden looked for Ron and Klein because he hated their death aura. The situation was reversed. Klein and Ron also hated the warden's huge life aura. "Sorry, Klein, I don't know how to summon this." Ron's eyes kept glancing at the skeleton emperor summoned by Klein, and his eyes revealed a look of envy. "What? You don't know how to summon the skeleton emperor?" When Klein heard this, his eyes widened as though he had heard the most inconceivable thing in the world. Are you a divine necromancer or not? Don't tell me you don't know how to summon a sacred domain skeleton overlord." The progression of necromancy magic was as follows: skeletons, skeletal warriors, skeletal magicians, dark knights, terror knights, skeletal lords, and skeletal monarchs. Ron's training program, on the other hand, jumped straight to the sacred domain's abyssal skeletal dragon after the Dread Knight, and then to the divine domain's frost dragon. For some reason, the summoning method of the sacred domain's skeletal lord and the divine domain's skeletal monarch was not passed down in the Amros continent. Even Homelin did not know how to do it, let alone Ron. Klein retreated to Ron's side and stopped. He looked at Ron in disbelief and sighed. "I originally wanted the two skeleton emperors to work together to fight, but be careful." Before he could finish speaking, Ron heard a whistling sound in his ears. He saw the warden, who had transformed into a treant, throw out a long branch whip and smash it at the two of them. Boom! The ground where Ron and Klein were standing just now had been torn apart. Countless gravel burst out, and Ron and Klein were nowhere to be seen. The warden had transformed into an octopus-like appearance. He waved the long whip in his hand and chased after the two of them. No matter where Ron and Klein hid, they could not escape the whip shadows that filled the sky. Ron's figure flashed as he quickly dodged the long whip. Although the whip was soft, its power was enough to split gold and stone. At this moment, a familiar voice entered his sea of consciousness. Ron immediately recognized that it was Klein's voice. "Ron, listen carefully. I'll now teach you the incantation and method to summon the skeleton emperor, as well as some of my own experiences during cultivation. I hope it'll be useful to you." Ron's spirit was immediately lifted when he heard this. This is the guidance from Klein. Nodding secretly, Ron listened carefully. The mysterious incantation and method were transmitted to Ron's sea of consciousness along with Klein's cold voice. With Klein's incantation and method, coupled with his cultivation experience, Ron quickly grasped the essentials of summoning with his comprehension and understanding of undead magic. At this moment, Ron took a deep breath and slowly waved the bone staff in his hand. A majestic aura of death seeped out from his body, and his eyes had turned dark green. Heroic spirit that has slept for 10,000 years. When you were alive, you were a great hero. After death, you are an immortal king. One day, you will return from the underworld with an army of undead. Not long after, the space channel opened, and a huge skeleton emperor appeared. It was like a firm guardian standing in front of Ron. It was exactly the same as Klein's skeleton emperor. Its face, covered by a steel mask, was filled with the aura of a king looking down on the world. Ron carefully looked at the skeleton emperor that he summoned for the first time, nodded secretly, and waved the staff in his hand. "Let's go, skeleton emperor. Tear that guy into pieces for me." The skeleton emperor slowly turned its head, and its eyes lit up with a red light. At this moment, it moved and joined the battle. When Klein saw this, he laughed. "Good fellow. I didn't think that Ron would be able to comprehend it so quickly. His comprehension is not bad." Fighting with the two skeleton emperors put a lot of pressure on the warden. Unlike the slow frost dragon, the skeleton emperor was fast and had extremely strong combat strength. Moreover, it could summon a large number of undead creatures to fight. It was like a natural king and also like an intelligent undead creature. The undead creatures summoned by the skeleton emperor to assist in the battle only listened to its orders. The two skeleton emperors attacked at the same time, summoning countless undead creatures to assist in the battle. In addition to the terrifying strength of Ron and Klein, the warden was almost completely suppressed. For a moment, roars came from the empty cave. "Are we going to win?" When Frigga saw this, her eyes lit up with hope. The two of them together are too powerful. "No, it's not like that." Pamir interrupted Frigga's words, shook his head, and sighed. "It's impossible for us to win. Don't forget, that guy hasn't used his divine power yet." Divine power? Thinking of the terrifying power of the green-clothed warden when he used his divine power, Frigga's face turned pale with fright. "Once he uses his divine power, we will die without a burial ground." Pamir's words were filled with despair and solemnity. At that moment, the battle had already reached its climax. The warden was unable to take down the skeleton monarchs for a long time, but Ron and Klein were getting more and more comfortable controlling the two skeleton monarchs. Especially Ron. He slowly grasped the essentials of controlling the skeleton monarchs and could even directly order the skeleton monarchs to use skills. The warden was at a complete disadvantage. He was beaten until he roared again and again, and cracks appeared on his hard defense. "Haha, how is it? This is the price you have to pay for looking down on the undead." Klein laughed and turned to Ron. "Ron, let's go together and kill this guy." Ron didn't answer. He was fully focused on controlling the skeleton emperor. From time to time, he would launch one or two attacks. Curses and undead attacks were used as if they didn't cost money. The warden was already impatient. With his strength, he couldn't even deal with two little undead bugs. This made him quite angry. At this time, he roared and exploded. Thorn's domain. At this time, a powerful life force erupted from the warden's body. It was as if a green and life aura quickly covered the entire space. The divine power of life appeared again. Swoosh! The warden poured the divine power of life into his body. A green light film appeared on his body. The light film was about 5 meters in diameter and firmly wrapped the warden's huge body. What? The divine power of life. Not good, retreat. Klein was shocked and immediately commanded the skeleton emperor to retreat. Ron's skeleton emperor was standing behind the warden. Ron saw the opportunity, gritted his teeth, and issued an order to the skeleton emperor. Ron's skeleton emperor moved and quickly approached the warden. He raised the scepter in his hand and slammed it down on the warden. This was a sneak attack. The warden didn't dodge. He just stood there straight. A sneer flashed across the corner of his mouth. Bang! Something amazing happened. The warden was still standing there. Nothing happened. However, the skeleton emperor summoned by Ron seemed to have been struck by lightning. It flew backward like a kite with a broken string. What's going on? Ron was stunned. At this time, he only felt a sharp pain in his head. It turned out that the skeleton emperor was injured. Its injury affected Ron as the controller. Ha ha! The warden laughed crazily. How pitiful. Let me tell you, my divine realm skill, Thorn's Domain, will reflect 150% of the damage. In other words, from now on, only I can attack you. You can't hit me at all. Damn it, Klein cursed. At this time, an idea flashed in his mind, and he shouted, Ron, let's not tangle with him in close combat. Use long-range attacks. After saying that, Klein stretched out his hand. A green ball of air appeared in his palm, and he threw it at the warden. Death coil. Countless ghosts let out ear-piercing cries that echoed in the cave. A powerful aura of death passed through the space and blasted towards the warden. The warden still didn't dodge. He sneered. Death coil hit the warden. However, in the next moment, a green light shot out from the warden's body and slammed into Klein. Klein let out a scream. He fell to the ground in pain, holding his head and rolling on the ground. The green ghost frantically wrapped around his head. His face was even more ferocious. The warden laughed heartily. Foolish necromancer. My Thorn's Domain can not only reflect close-range attacks, it can also reflect long-range attacks. Now you've had a taste of your own skill. Klein, are you okay? Ron exclaimed. Woo, woo, woo. Klein's eyes rolled back. The veins on his face were exposed. He gritted his teeth and looked like he was in extreme pain. It seemed that the reflected death coil had invaded his soul. At this moment, Klein was struggling with the souls he released. He couldn't speak for a while. Prepare to die, invaders. The warden laughed wildly. Countless long whips shook and blasted towards Ron. Not good, dodge. Ron's figure flashed, and he immediately disappeared from where he was. At this moment, Ron was so depressed that he wanted to vomit blood. The warden's Thorn's Domain was just like the invincible domain of the Holy Knight. He could hit others, but they couldn't hit him. To a certain extent, it was even more powerful than the invincible domain of the Holy Knight because it could reflect 150% of the damage. Facing the warden's barrage of attacks, Ron could only desperately dodge, hoping to wait until the warden's invincible state wore off. But Ron didn't know that the Thorn's Domain was different from the invincible domain of the Holy Knight. Unless the user wanted to, the Thorn's Domain would never disappear. Bang! A loud sound was heard. Finally, Ron couldn't dodge in time and was hit by the warden's long whip. He fell heavily to the ground and spat out a mouthful of blood. Ron only felt dizzy. His organs were almost displaced, and there wasn't a single bone in his body that didn't hurt. He struggled a few times and tried to get up, but he fell heavily to the ground again. At this time, he saw a pair of huge feet. The soles of the feet were covered in what looked like tree roots. They were tightly entwined, and bits of green light extended from them, emitting powerful divine power of life. Ron looked up and saw a face that was as dry and twisted as a tree bark. This face was filled with intense, killing intent. A sense of helplessness welled up in Ron's heart. The strength of this expert of life was simply too powerful. He could even use divine power. Originally, the warden was no match for Ron and Klein, but he used the divine power of life. Divine power, the legendary power of the gods. Its appearance was enough to change the rules of the battle. If the warden hadn't used his divine power to activate the Thorn's Domain at the critical moment, how could Ron and the others have been defeated so badly? Not to mention the Thorn's Domain, even the falling stars and twining roots were enough to make Ron and the others suffer as long as they were skills of life that were cast with divine power. Divine power was indeed powerful. In front of an expert of the divine realm with divine power, ordinary experts of the divine realm could only be slaughtered unilaterally, even if their strength was on the same level. Wait, divine power. Thinking of this, Ron couldn't help but smile bitterly. The divine power of death in his body had been used up long ago, and the spirit summoning pagoda in his soul ring didn't produce any new divine power of death. If he could use the divine power of death, he might be able to fight the warden, but now, could it be that I'm going to die here today? Ron thought sadly. He felt his strength gradually drain away, and he no longer had the strength to struggle. Undead, the death aura on your body really makes me hate it. The warden stared at Ron and sniffed, a trace of hatred in his eyes. At this time, he raised his huge and heavy right arm and said fiercely to Ron, I want to say lowly and dirty creatures like you shouldn't exist in this world. Die. The warden sneered, and his huge fist smashed down on Ron, who couldn't resist. It's over. Chapter 770. Just as Ron was in despair, a thunderous sound rang out. Immediately after, lightning surrounded him, making pa, pa, pa sounds, forming an extremely powerful lightning magnetic field around Ron. Ron was stunned. He looked up and saw Frigga's face, which had turned pale due to fear. At this moment, his eyes were wide open. It was Frigga who saw Ron in danger. Although she knew that there was a huge gap between them, she still made her move without hesitation. Her first move was her strongest killing move, Thunderbolt Descent. The warden's body moved like a boulder, allowing the countless bolts of lightning to strike him, allowing the countless bolts of lightning to wander around his body. The next moment, a sinister smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. The countless bolts of lightning on the warden's body condensed to form a huge lightning ball. Then, the spikes on the warden's back suddenly opened, and the huge lightning ball came out of his body. No, Ron shouted. He wanted to remind Frigga to stop, but it was too late. Boom! The lightning ball, which was 150% more powerful than Heavenly Thunder's descent, hit Freyja hard. She let out a muffled groan, and her delicate body floated into the air as if she was unconscious. Blood splattered in the air. She was like a beautiful fairy, streaking across the night sky like a meteor. The brilliance of life bloomed completely in an instant. Fu! Li Jia! Ron's eyes became blood red. His lips trembled, and his fingernails had sunk deep into his flesh. Blood flowed slowly from his palms to the ground, dyeing the ground red. At this moment, his eyes were filled with bone-deep hatred. He hated himself for not being strong enough. He hated himself for not being able to protect Frigga, the woman of the dragons who had once helped him. So it's the elemental magical beast fairy dragon. But it's really too weak. Trying to sneak up on me with this kind of strength is courting death, the warden muttered to himself. To him, this was just a small interlude. It did not affect his desire to kill Ron in the slightest. The warden sneered. He slowly lifted one foot and stomped Ron to the ground. Then he slowly exerted force. Woo! Ron used all his strength to support himself. The sharp thorns pierced his skin and blood flowed down his forehead. At this moment, Ron's vision gradually became blurry. He seemed to hear the sound of his skull cracking. Filthy undead. Remember this well after you go to hell. The one who killed you is Raditz of the Tree Elves. Warden Raditz sneered. He liked the feeling of slowly killing his opponent. If he wanted, he could save this dirty undead when he was about to die and then do it again. At that time, death might not be the most terrifying outcome for Ron. What was more terrifying than death was the transition between life and death, as well as the endless torture. Raditz was a tree elven of the life element. He definitely had the ability to do this, but he was impatient now. He still had to chase after the other fish of Baz besides Ron and Klein. Remember, Ron said word by word. With a plop, blood burst out from the corner of his mouth. Only then did he know that the powerful life element powerhouse in front of him was called Raditz. Stop! Just as Ron's life signs were gradually disappearing, a shout attracted Raditz's attention. Raditz felt strange. He retracted his power and looked back. only to see that the other undead had stood up at some point in time. He was gasping for breath and trembling all over. One of his hands was tightly clenched, and his cold eyes revealed a deep, murderous intent. "You're not dead yet." Raditz was somewhat surprised, but then he laughed. "Huh, you don't have to be too anxious. It will soon be your turn. Today. None of you invaders can escape. All of you will die." "Is that so?" "Ha ha." Klein laughed wildly. His laughter faintly revealed a trace of madness. At this time, he stopped laughing and said, "Scum of the life element, take a look at what this is." After saying that, he slowly opened his tightly clenched hand. A thing as small as a strand of hair was constantly jumping in Klein's palm. "What?" Raditz's pupils shrank, and then his eyes suddenly opened wide. The power emitted by the tiny thing in the other party's hand was incomparably terrifying. If Raditz's guess was correct, this hair-like thing was the divine power of death. This guy actually has the divine power of death. Raditz recovered from his shock. It seems that he isn't an ordinary realm of the gods' powerhouse. Many realm of the gods' powerhouses who could use divine power were talented and intelligent people. This was because they had already comprehended the power of laws. Klein actually has divine power? His divine power. Where did it come from? Looking at Klein holding the divine power in his hand, Ron sucked in a breath of cold air. The surprise that Klein had brought him was simply too great. It was shocking. His strength, in the end, to what extent has it reached? Ron thought. Divine power of death? Interesting. Raditz suppressed the shock in his heart and let out a long sigh. "What do you want?" "Very simple." At this time, Klein opened his mouth. "If your excellency is willing to let us go and let us reach the planar teleportation array, then we will go our separate ways and never have anything to do with each other. We also have no intention of becoming your enemy. And if I don't agree?" Hearing this, Raditz's expression sank. This was absolutely impossible for him to do. "If you don't agree," Klein coldly smiled, "then no one can predict the consequences. Perhaps we will die, but you definitely won't live." Klein's words were threatening. His hand trembled slightly, and the divine power of death in his hand emitted even more power. Klein's words aroused the anger in Raditz's heart. "Ha ha! You think you can threaten me just because you have divine power? Let me tell you, stop dreaming. You are definitely not the only one with divine power." Raditz roared. He stretched out his hand, and a powerful life force rapidly condensed. Not long after, a small green thread appeared in his palm. That was the concentrated essence of life force. At this moment, it was emitting boundless life force that resonated with Klein's divine power of death. At this moment, Klein also knew that he had no way out. He clenched his teeth and said, "Since that is the case, then die." While speaking, the black fog on Klein's body surged, as if he was a figure wrapped in thick fog. Countless white ghosts rushed out of his body, wailing and screaming in the entire space. It was a soul-stirring sight. At this time, Klein slowly raised his right hand, and the divine power of death in his hand disappeared into thin air. The next moment, it turned into a 3-meter-long, pitch-black spear. The long spear was engraved with runes that symbolized death. Behind him, the black fog formed a huge death god figure. The terrifying aura made everyone's heart tremble. Spear of Death. Klein threw the Spear of Death at Raditz. The powerful death energy passed through space, causing the entire space to shake. "Very good, then come. I want to see which is stronger, the law of life or the law of death." Raditz was not to be outdone. He stretched out his hand, and the wisp of life force disappeared. He, who had fused with the divine power of life, instantly shone with a green radiance. His body glowed with life force, and countless branches stretched out. The sweat on his body was covered in a layer of crispy green. At this time, he slowly raised his hands, and a huge green ball condensed in his palm. It grew bigger and bigger, and the figure of the goddess of life appeared around him. It was a tall young woman with an elven appearance. She had a pair of long elven ears and was wearing a luxurious elven robe. Her eyebrows were lowered, and she was holding a magic staff. She stood between heaven and earth with her head held high. Her flawless face was filled with a sacred aura, making people not dare to blaspheme her. Under the nourishment of the aura of life, all the plants in the surroundings grew at a crazy speed. The grass quietly poked its head out of the cracks in the rocks, and the moss at the edge of the cave quickly covered the surrounding land. Flower of life. While speaking, the green ball in Radit's hand suddenly opened, and a pink radiance spread out, just like a beautiful flower opening its braids. 1 layer, 2 layers, countless braids spread out. In Radit's hand, the flower of life was dazzling, emitting a bright radiance that instantly illuminated the pitch-black cave. Raditz took a deep breath, a trace of determination in his eyes. His hand gently moved, and the flower of life was slowly sent out. The curtains of a battle between life and death had finally been raised. The spear of death and the flower of life quickly approached each other. In an instant, time seemed to stop, and space also seemed to stop. In this space of several dozen square meters, only 2 terrifying forces were left intertwining with each other. This was the peak confrontation between the god of death and the goddess of life. In a confrontation of this level, the divine power of life and the divine power of death seemed to have their own consciousness and seemed to have excluded Klein and Raditz. Boom! An earth-shattering sound echoed as the 2 terrifying forces collided, bursting out huge sparks. In an instant, the entire cave shook, and countless boulders fell from the top of the cave, falling to the ground and shattering. At the place where the 2 forces clashed, the ground kept sinking, forming a terrifying, bottomless cave. Rumble! The shaking finally stopped. The destruction caused by the divine power of death and the divine power of life had turned the entire space into a mess. Not a single intact rock could be seen within several dozen meters. Klein and Raditz were standing face to face. Klein was clutching his chest, breathing heavily with a pained expression. On the other hand, Raditz was expressionless, and he didn't seem to be injured at all. Huff, huff, huff. Klein was gasping for breath. Slowly, the corners of his mouth rose, revealing a self-deprecating smile. You won. With that said, Klein knelt on the ground with a thud and fell straight to the ground. Chapter 771. Huff, huff. Tree elf Raditz gasped for breath, his sturdy chest heaving up and down. Competing with Klein using his divine power had consumed a lot of his energy. He couldn't even maintain the god's domain skill, Thorn's domain. The spikes on his body started shrinking, and the green halo around his body started disappearing. The strength of a powerhouse who had comprehended the laws of God's domain wasn't something an ordinary powerhouse of God's domain could compare to. Klein's frightening attack with his death divine power had almost made Raditz taste death. At this time, Raditz slowly calmed down, and his eagle-like eyes shone with a bright light. Oomph! Lowly reptiles will always be reptiles. No matter how you struggle, you can't escape the fate of death. As Raditz spoke, he seemed to be comforting himself. A trace of blood slowly flowed down his forehead, blurring his vision. In one day, he had continuously used his divine power to cast Meteor Fall, Entanglement of Roots, Thorn's Domain, and Flower of Life. Even if someone as strong as Raditz had sufficient strength, there was still a vacuum at this moment. He was currently at his weakest. Nevertheless, Raditz still obtained the final victory. Ron and Klein were no match for him. No, it's still too early to say that. At this time, a shadow flashed in front of Raditz and quickly approached him. He was slightly startled, and before he could react, a piercing pain came from his body. Bang! The seriously injured Ron had stood up at some point. He took 2 steps forward and suddenly threw himself forward. His hand flashed, and a sharp bone spur appeared in his palm. The bone spur in Ron's hand ruthlessly pierced into Radit's lower back. In an instant, blood splattered everywhere. Ron, Pamir, who was watching from a distance, was stunned. He didn't expect that Ron could still stand up after being injured to this extent. Raditz was both startled and angry. He didn't dare to believe that the seriously injured Ron still had the ability to fight. In a moment of carelessness, he fell for it. "What do you want?" Raditz quickly calmed down and asked. He wasn't worried about the injury on his lower back. For a powerhouse who cultivated the power of life, such a small injury could be quickly healed. What he needed to do now was to stabilize the necromancer. After all, the necromancer didn't have any ability to resist. "What do you want?" Ron struggled to support his seriously injured body, and the corners of his mouth revealed a cold smile. "Didn't you say that we undead are lowly reptiles? Very good. Today, you will die in the hands of 2 lowly reptiles." After saying that, he forcefully thrust the bone spur forward. In an instant, Raditz's eyes opened wide, revealing an extremely frightened expression. He finally remembered that although the strength of these 2 undead creatures was low, they were most proficient in soul attacks. A numb feeling came from the back of his waist. What made him even more terrified was that the other party's soul power was rapidly attacking his sea of consciousness through the wound on his back. A stabbing pain came from Raditz's head, as if he was being bitten by thousands of ghosts. This kind of pain came from the depths of his soul, making him wish he was dead. Normally, the invasion of a mere soul power wouldn't be able to do anything to a powerhouse who had comprehended part of the law of life, but he was currently extremely weak and didn't have any power to suppress the invading soul power. At this moment, Raditz finally felt the fear of death. "No, don't!" Raditz shouted and struggled with all his might, but Ron firmly held him in place. The powerful soul power kept invading his body, and Raditz's struggle became weaker and weaker. At this time, a boom was heard in his mind, as if something had exploded. Then, his vision turned blank. Ah! Raditz groaned a few times. At this time, his body slowly shrank at a speed visible to the naked eye. The leaves and branches on his body started disappearing, revealing his original appearance as a tree elf. Raditz's eyes were wide open, but they were empty, as if he had lost consciousness. Finally, his body softly fell to the ground. Finally, it's over. Ron loosened his grip and heavily sat on the ground, gasping for breath. This nightmarish life powerhouse had finally died. This should be some consolation for his dead companion. Ron slightly raised his head and met Pamir's gaze. The latter smiled at him and gave him a thumbs up. At this time, Ron saw Pamir crouch down and help Frigga up with difficulty. He carefully examined her injuries before raising his head to look at Ron and shaking his head. "It doesn't matter. Although Madame Frigga's injuries are serious, fortunately, she is still alive." Hearing that Frigga was still alive, Ron relaxed. He didn't know when it started, but this beautiful and noble speaker of Noah Continent's parliament had slowly occupied a place in his heart. At this time, a familiar voice entered his ears. "Ron, well done." It was Klein who had gotten up at some point and looked at Ron. At this moment, he was covered in wounds and looked rather miserable. His iconic black robe had almost turned into rags, but he seemed to be in good spirits. His pitch-black eyes flickered, and the corners of his mouth revealed a smile of approval. "Thank you." Ron smiled modestly and asked with concern, "Are you okay?" "Fortunately, I won't die." Klein struggled to get up, glanced at the warden's corpse on the ground, and sighed. "Fortunately, you seized the opportunity to kill him. Otherwise, none of us would have survived." In Klein's opinion, Ron had seized the best opportunity to attack. That was when Raditz was at his weakest after using his divine power of life and launched the most fatal blow. If he had been a little slower at that time and let this guy catch his breath, even if it was only for 5 minutes, the situation would have been different. Perhaps they would be the ones lying on the ground now. At this moment, Ron was almost at the end of his rope. He dragged his weak body and slowly walked to Pamir's side. He took Frigga from his hands, lifted her up, and slowly put her down, letting her lean against the wall. At this time, Frigga's eyes moved, and she slowly woke up. When she woke up and saw Ron, she was overjoyed and grabbed his arm. "Ron, are you okay?" Frigga ignored the injuries on her body and asked about Ron's situation first. She looked at Ron with eyes full of concern. "I'm fine, just a little injured." Looking at Frigga's clear eyes, Ron's heart was touched. "You were beaten up badly, but fortunately we didn't die. I'm relieved to see that you're fine," Frigga said with a sigh of relief. At this time, she discovered that Ron's injuries were more serious than they looked. If only there were potions of life, your injuries would be healed immediately, Frigga said with a pained expression. Ron smiled. "It's fine. There are still 2 levels to the interplanar teleportation formation at the bottom of Bartlow's prison. I believe we'll be able to return to our respective planes soon." "That's good." Frigga smiled. She reached out and brushed Ron's messy hair away from his forehead, her eyes full of tenderness. Looking at Frigga's peerless beauty, which was not inferior to Kadina's, Ron's heart swayed. Fairy dragons were a fatal attraction to any male creature in the world. They were beautiful, noble, powerful, and rare. Even in the main plane, the beautiful and powerful fairy dragons were the targets of all races. Frigga's love for Ron was like a small seed, constantly growing, slowly taking root and sprouting. "Hee, stop dreaming." Ron was talking when an ice-cold voice suddenly interrupted them, startling the 3 of them. In the quiet cave, it was particularly abrupt. Ron turned around and was startled. He saw that Warden Raditz had woken up at some point. Although he wasn't dead yet, he only had a single breath left. He was lying on the ground, staring at the 2 with his yellow eyes. He was smiling, the corners of his mouth revealing a trace of mockery. "You think that by defeating me, you can reach the teleportation formation at the bottom of Bartlow's prison? Ha! Impossible." As Raditz spoke, blood flowed from the corner of his mouth and dripped to the ground. His expression was extremely sinister. "Let me tell you, these pitiful worms. At the bottom of Bartlow's prison, there is an existence even more powerful than me. Compared to him, my strength is like an ant. He is the guardian of Bartlow's prison. Lord Ancient Dragon Maxwell. Ancient Dragon Maxwell, an existence even more powerful than you?" A look of despair appeared on Ron's face. With the current state of the 3 of them, not to mention the primordious dragon, the guardian of prison Bartolos, who was countless times stronger than Raditz, even if another Raditz came, they would not be able to resist. Ron's heart sank to the bottom. "Lowly worms, you will never be able to reach the teleportation formation at the bottom of Bartlow's prison. You are doomed to fail and become food for Lord Maxwell." "Ha ha!" Raditz laughed like a madman, his hoarse voice echoing in the cave, making one's hair stand on end. At this time, Klein, who was leaning against the wall, suddenly raised his head, his eyes flashing. "You really talk too much nonsense." With that said, Klein slowly extended his arm. A cyan beam of light shot out from his palm and blasted into Warden Raditz's body, enveloping his entire body. "Ah! Ah! Ah!" Raditz let out a blood-curdling scream. His body trembled violently, and an indescribable fear appeared on his face. Then, something terrifying happened. Under the cyan light, Raditz's eyes turned white, and a smoke-like thing with Raditz's face was forcibly peeled off from his face. Following the cyan light, it slowly entered Klein's knowledge sea. Soul devour. Ron was stunned. He didn't expect Raditz's soul to be devoured by Klein. This wasn't a good ending for Raditz. Klein closed his eyes and completely devoured and digested Raditz's soul. Only then did he slowly open his eyes and look at Ron with a trace of blame in his cold eyes. "You should have killed him," Klein slowly said to Ron. "Since you didn't do it, I could only do it for you. Powerhouses who cultivate the power of life have powerful vitality. If he didn't die, then the ones dying would have been us. Sorry, it's all my fault." Ron was silent for a moment. Although he didn't agree with Klein's approach, Ron knew that Klein's approach was the best choice for now. "Let's rest for a while, then continue on our way," Chapter 772. The spacious and gloomy cave was silent. Only the sound of everyone's breathing could be heard, and from time to time, one or two painful groans could be heard. Everyone, including Ron, was seriously injured. After some simple bandaging, they leaned against the wall and rested quietly, slowly recovering the strength they had consumed during the battle. Warden Radit's soulless corpse lay there quietly, but no one was interested in looking at it. After an unknown amount of time, Ron slowly opened his eyes. He discovered that his soul force had recovered slightly, and his seriously injured body was slowly regaining strength. He slowly looked around. Everyone had entered a state of cultivation, except for Pamir, who was asleep. In a state of cultivation, one's strength recovered the fastest. Frigga was no exception. She was sitting cross-legged on a rock with her eyes closed. Traces of power were constantly flowing through her body. At this moment, she was as holy as a fairy. At this time, Ron's eyes fell on the injured Klein, and he couldn't help but take a few more glances. To be honest, Ron was full of curiosity about this mysterious necromancer from the main plane. As if sensing Ron's gaze, Klein opened his eyes and looked in Ron's direction. The two's eyes met. "You're awake?" Klein asked. He looked at Ron, and a trace of gentleness appeared in his gloomy eyes. "Your soul force has recovered a bit, right?" "Yes." Ron nodded. "But I can't move freely yet." "Oh," Klein replied. "Then let's rest for a while more." With that said, he slowly leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. After a while, Ron thought for a while, and still couldn't restrain his curiosity. He couldn't help but ask, "Klein, can I ask you a question?" Klein slowly opened his eyes and looked at Ron in amazement. He gently nodded and said, "Go ahead. Where did your divine power of death come from?" Who gave you your divine power of death?" Ron thought for a long time before asking. "So that's what you're asking?" Klein smiled. "Divine power of death. Of course it's mine." "What?" This time, it was Ron's turn to be shocked. He cried out involuntarily. "You mean this is your divine power of death? You actually have divine power?" "Yes, I have divine power." "What's so strange about that?" Klein casually replied. Could it be that only gods can have divine power?" Ron stuttered. "Or you're a god?" In Ron's opinion, no matter if it was the divine power of death, destruction, or life, they were all powers that only gods could have. If an expert in the divine realm had divine power, then it must have been bestowed by a real god. For example, the destruction divine power in the hands of the demon Sophia was bestowed by the powerful god Thor from the main plane of hell. There is also the life divine power that the ancient tree Noah Hill bestowed to Undine. There is even the death divine power that the owner of the soul ring left in the soul ring for Ron. Ron had always believed that the owner of the soul ring was a real god. In Ron's understanding, the death divine power in Klein's hands must have been bestowed by a god who cultivated in the power of death. How is that possible? Could a mortal also have divine power? After listening to Ron's doubts, Klein smiled. He pondered for a moment and threw a question at Ron. "Ron, in your opinion, God, what is it?" "God, what is it?" Hearing Klein's question, Ron only felt an explosion in his mind. For a moment, countless thoughts rushed into his mind, causing his brain to become chaotic. Ron stood there blankly. He realized that he had never thought about this question. God, what was it? Where did he come from? How powerful was he? Ron murmured, "What is a god? Can't a god produce divine power?" "God, of course they have divine power." Klein thought for a moment and answered. "But the problem is, in my understanding, those who produce divine power are not necessarily gods." Ron was confused by Klein's words. "You mean, even if they're not gods, can they also produce divine power?" "I'm not talking about the divine power that they possess, but the divine power produced through their own strength." "Of course I know." Klein smiled. He looked at Ron and decided to teach this country undead who didn't know anything. "Ron, in your opinion, what is divine power?" "What is divine power?" Ron was a little confused by Klein's words. "Isn't divine power a power that gods possess?" "You're right, but not exactly." Klein restrained the smile on his face and became very serious. To tell you the truth, Ron, the so-called divine power, is actually a law, and there are many kinds of laws. For example, the law of death that we undead practice and the law of life that Guy used just now. These laws are part of the power. Those who have comprehended the law of this domain, the power of the law they possess, is divine power. The law is divine power? Ron was completely stunned when he heard this, but he still didn't understand some things. Isn't cultivation to remind one's realm? Then what's with this law? It's right to remind one's realm, but Ron, have you ever thought about it? The so-called realm is the degree of comprehension of the law. The deeper the comprehension of the law, the higher the realm, and the higher the realm, the stronger the strength, Klein said. So in the final analysis, it's still about the comprehension of the law. Klein paused and continued. In my understanding, a god in the true sense refers to a strong person who has completely integrated a certain law, such as the law of life, the law of death, the law of destruction, and so on. When a certain law is completely integrated, it can produce great power. This power is enough to destroy heaven and earth. This is our so-called God. Then is the one who uses divine power God? Of course not. There are only two ways to obtain divine power. One is through inheritance, that is, the divine power bestowed by a powerful God. Of course, it must be the same type of divine power. The other way is through the comprehension of a part of the power of the law and the divine power produced. A part? Ron asked in surprise. Yes, it's a part of the power of the law. Although the divine power produced in this way can't compare to a real God, it's still a part of the power of the law. Compared to the average God Realm Master, or even a high-level God Realm Master, peak God Realm Master, and so on, it's much more powerful. Klein talked nonstop, and Ron listened very seriously, very carefully for fear of missing a word. Chapter 773. Divine power is also a type of power. Through the use of divine power, domain techniques will become even more powerful. For example, the technique I used in the battle with the life element expert was just an ordinary bone spear, but with the addition of the divine power of death, it became a terrifying death spear. That's right. Ron nodded inwardly. He recalled the first time he used the divine power of death. It was an ordinary bone spear, but this ordinary bone spear had almost destroyed half of Asinaris, an important border town of the Holy Roman Empire. The so-called gods aren't mysterious things. They're just experts who have fused with the power of laws. Ron, if you can fuse with the power of laws, you can also become a god. I'm not talking about experts of the divine realm who use divine power, but true gods. Klein said with a smile. Fusing with the power of laws? Ron laughed involuntarily. To him, not to mention the power of the law of death, even increasing his realm was so difficult. As for becoming a true god, Ron only thought about it. Although Klein said it casually, how could the gap between gods and mortals be made up by talent and hard work? Then, how? Can one comprehend part of the power of laws and produce divine power? Just as Ron and Klein were discussing divine power in full swing, a clear voice interrupted them. The two of them looked back and saw that Frigga had finished her training at some point and was quietly listening to their conversation. Klein's unreserved conversation with Ron had not only enlightened Ron, it had also greatly benefited her. Klein smiled. This is something that depends on each person's perception and luck. Amongst all the powerhouses of the realm of the gods, those who can truly comprehend a portion of the power of laws and produce their own divine power, 1 in 10 would be considered pretty good. Frigga made an O sound, a trace of disappointment in her beautiful eyes. However, as a genius, she quickly felt at ease. No matter what, strength ultimately depended on one's own cultivation. At this time, Pamir woke up from his deep sleep and smiled at everyone. Since everyone has more or less recovered, let's set off, Klein said as he struggled to get up from the ground. Ron and Frigga also stood up. Ron pushed the wheelchair, while Frigga and Klein walked in front. They continued to go deeper into the 17th floor of Bartlow's prison. As everyone was injured, the journey was rather slow, especially for Ron and Klein. Every step they took affected their wounds, and they could only frown and bear with it. However, Ron didn't feel lonely along the way. Ever since Klein gave Ron pointers on divine power, Ron had also let down his guard. The two chatted along the way and quickly became friends who could talk about anything. Klein had already become Ron's mentor. Not only did he give Ron pointers on his cultivation, he also told him many things about the undead plane. Ron slowly let down his guard, and his impression of Klein also improved. As they walked, the cave became narrower and narrower. Soon, two forks appeared in the path ahead. There were two forks, one on the left and one on the right. They could only fit 2 or 3 people side by side. They emitted a gloomy aura, and one couldn't see the end of them. Frigga, who was walking in front, hesitantly looked at the 2 dark holes. She stopped and looked at Ron. "Which way should we go? Klein, what do you think?" Ron turned to ask Klein. Klein looked at the 2 holes and helplessly shook his head. "I don't know." At this time, Pamir, who was sitting in a wheelchair, pondered for a moment. "How about this? I suggest that we split up. Each of the forks will send one person to explore. If we find the black vortex that leads to the 17th level, we'll turn back." Pamir's suggestion received everyone's approval. Frigga was the first to respond. "I'll go to the left hole. Then I'll go to the right hole," Klein said. "Ron, you and Pamir stay here and wait for us." Ron was shocked. "How can that be?" "Klein, you're injured. Let me go. You and Pamir wait for me here. I'll inform you when I find the way." "Nonsense. Don't tell me you're not injured." Klein pulled a long face when he heard this. "Let me go." After some argument, Klein finally compromised. Ron and Frigga went into the 2 holes, leaving Klein and Pamir to wait. Pamir and Klein looked at each other and then looked away. For some reason, the 2 of them could not get close. Klein did not say a word. He walked to a corner and sat down. He took out a water bottle from his spatial ring and opened it. Gulp, gulp. He drank a few mouthfuls and wiped his mouth. He looked at Pamir and smiled. "Here." With a flick of his hand, the water bottle flew to Pamir. "Thank you." Pamir caught it firmly and drank a few mouthfuls. He then turned it over. "There's no more." Klein frowned. This was his last water bottle. Although the undead did not need much water, it would be troublesome if there was no water to drink. He thought for a moment. "I seem to remember that we passed by a river on our way here. How about this? You wait here. I'll go find some water." As he spoke, he struggled to stand up and limped back. Pamir looked at Klein's figure walking in front of him. At this time, his smiling face slowly darkened. "I'd like to see what tricks you're up to." He pushed his wheelchair and quietly followed. Unlike Ron, Pamir was especially wary of Klein, this mysterious necromancer. He was afraid that Klein would harm Ron. Due to his injury, Klein did not walk very fast. He did not release his spiritual sense, nor did he use any detection skills like crows or spirits. He was no different from an ordinary person. Pamir had received professional military training. Tailing and stalking was a piece of cake for him. He carefully hid behind Klein and followed unhurriedly. Klein, who did not sense anything, continued to walk forward. Not long after, he found the underground river that they had just passed. Klein squatted down and took out a water bottle from his spatial ring. He pressed it under the water. The cold river water flowed, making a gulp-gulp sound and splashing countless bubbles. Am I overthinking things? He doesn't have any ill intentions towards us. On a protruding rock not far away, Pamir looked at everything condescendingly as he muttered to himself. Klein quickly filled the water bottle and took out a few more. Finally, he cupped a handful of river water and began to wash his face. He then took off his tattered necromancer's robe and changed into another set of black necromancer's robes from his spatial ring. Pamir looked at it for a long time, but he didn't find anything. Just as he was about to turn back, something fell out of the necromancer's robe with a thud. Pamir looked down, and his body trembled. His eyes were filled with disbelief. What? The item that had fallen out of Klein's robes was none other than a red silk armband with the word swastika engraved on it. In the dim cave, the bright red silk armband with the word swastika was especially eye-catching. Pamir stared blankly at the item, his mind blank. The red silk armband. Why would Klein have this on him? Could it be? Chapter 774. Klein was shocked. He immediately picked up the armband and put it away. Then, like a thief, he looked around with a guilty conscience. Only when he found that there was no one around did he heave a sigh of relief. But in the next moment, Klein was completely dumbfounded. This was because he had inadvertently released his spiritual perception and swept over the figure of an acquaintance. That figure was pushing the wheelchair and staring at him with a pale face. His eyes were filled with disbelief. Pamir? Klein was alarmed when he saw Pamir. His mind raced. Could it be that he saw everything? The two of them stared at each other in silence. The atmosphere was strangely stiff. Gritting his teeth, he transformed into a blob of black fog and flew up with a whoosh. You saw everything? Klein stood in front of Pamir and asked. His face was frighteningly dark. Yes, I saw everything. After a long while, Pamir raised his head and looked at Klein fearlessly. What did you see? Klein frowned. I saw something I never wanted to see. Pamir stared coldly at Klein. He was so angry that he seemed to be spitting fire. I didn't expect you to be a member of the Red Silk Army. Actually, I should have known when you entered Bartlow's prison in such a high-profile manner. At that time, you even came into contact with a tall man. Am I right? Pamir's expression became agitated. He pointed at Klein and said, It was you guys who spread false information in the main plains and lured us here to search for treasure. Then, you guys destroyed all the teleportation points and forced us to enter Bartlow's prison. All of this was for you to deal with the ancient guardians of Bartlow's prison, right? Klein fell silent and didn't say a word. His pair of cold eyes flickered. I almost forgot. The leader of the Red Silk Army, Utaris, is imprisoned in the lowest level of Bartlow's prison. Your ultimate goal was to rescue him from prison, right? In order to achieve such a goal, you used us. What a vicious scheme. Pamir waved his hands in agitation as he rambled on, as though he wanted to vent all of his anger. That's right. If it weren't for the fake news released by the Red Silk Army, why would his 75th Goblin Army come to this godforsaken land of exile? How could his army have been completely annihilated? How could all of his brothers have died? How did his legs become like this? All of this was because of this hateful Red Silk Army. Are you done? Faced with Pamir's torrent of accusations, Klein's expression remained calm. At that moment, he smiled. Dear Pamir, how can you say that? Looks like you've really misunderstood. That's right. This is indeed the armband of the Red Silk Army. But why don't you ask where it came from? Klein took out the armband of the Red Silk Army and waved it in front of Pamir. With a pleasant expression, he said, To tell you the truth, this isn't actually mine. It's just a spoil of war. On the way to Bartlow's prison, I accidentally met a guy from the Red Silk Army. This guy didn't know what was good for him and actually attacked me. Later, I killed him and took this from him. I thought it might be useful in the future, so I kept it, before Klein could finish, Pamir's saliva sprayed all over his face. Pamir pointed at him and cursed loudly. You're full of lies. You still want to lie to me? Who was the one who kept this like a thief? You still have the face to say it's a spoil of war? Pamir's eyes were red as he pointed at Klein and said loudly, Speak. What is the purpose of this Red Silk Army scum getting close to Ron and the others? Pamir was now most worried about Ron. He was afraid that Ron would be deceived by this lying guy, especially since he came from the terrifying Red Silk Army. Enough. Seeing that he couldn't hide it from Pamir, Klein's patience ran out. His expression turned cold and bone-chilling. A powerhouse from the sacred domain with broken legs dares to meddle in my affairs? Who the F***CK do you think you are? Klein sneered. It must have been hard for you to follow me around in a wheelchair for so long. Since you want to know, I'll tell you. That's right. I'm from the Red Silk Army. What? Even though Pamir had already guessed it, he still couldn't suppress the shock in his heart when he heard it from Klein. Klein grinned sinisterly and said, That's right. Since 100,000 years ago, the Red Silk Army was wiped out by the forces of the major planes. The remaining forces were forced to move into the shadows. I'm the direct commander of this force. As expected, your goal is still to rescue Lord Utaris, who's imprisoned in Bartlow's prison. Pamir's voice became stern. I can ignore the matters of the Red Silk Army. But why are you getting close to Ron? Could it be that you intend to let Ron join you? Ha! Ha! When Klein heard that, he laughed sinisterly. At that moment, his hand shot out like lightning and grabbed Pamir by the collar, lifting him up like he was grabbing a chick. What are you trying to do? Pamir asked in a trembling voice as he was lifted into the air by Klein. His body with broken legs struggled nonstop. At this moment, a trace of panic finally appeared in Pamir's eyes. He finally remembered that his so-called partner in front of him, the divine necromancer Klein, was such a terrifying existence. What am I trying to do? Klein laughed sinisterly. You're about to die, and you're still concerned about others. Should I say that you're loyal? Or stupid? If that fool Ron finds out, he'll be very sad, won't he? Pamir, since you like to ask questions so much. Then, Klein laughed, following which his smile turned cold. Go to hell and ask. After saying this, he let out a low growl and opened his mouth wide. Soul devour. Pong bang. Pamir felt as if he had been struck by lightning. His mind went blank, and he could feel the pain coming from the depths of his soul. It was the feeling of being forcibly torn apart. Pamir's eyes were wide open, filled with fear. At this moment, his eyes and mouth had turned dark green. Countless souls flew out of his eyes and mouth and entered Klein's mouth. After a short while, Pamir's struggles finally stopped. His body drooped down weakly, and his eyes gradually dimmed. He had become a corpse that had lost consciousness. The cave became even darker. Everything that Klein had done had been perfect. In the 16th floor of Bartlow's prison, no one had discovered anything. Now that Pamir knew everything, Klein had no other choice but to silence him. Asterisk bang. Asterisk Klein threw Pamir's soulless body heavily onto the wheelchair. Pamir's eyes were wide open. Both his legs were broken, and his eyes were filled with extreme fear. At this moment, he was lying quietly in the wheelchair, no longer breathing. This fellow is really powerful. He was able to deduce so much from a small armband that fell out. Leaving him alive would be a disaster, so it's better to kill him as soon as possible. Klein looked at Pamir's corpse as he muttered to himself. He paused, and the corners of his mouth curled up, revealing a sinister smile. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.